The ledger trembled in Nora Whitmore's hands as she stared at the numbers that didn't add up. $3,000 paid twice. Interest charged on money already returned. Her future husband's ranch wasn't dying from bad luck. Someone was killing it deliberately, methodically, like bleeding a trapped animal. And that someone had just sent word he was arriving tomorrow. Most mail-order brides would have run. But Nora had spent her entire life learning one truth. The only way out was through. This is the story of the woman who walked into a trap and turned it inside out. If you want to see how one person with nothing but a sharp mind can bring down an empire built on lies, stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The train lurched to a stop with a scream of metal that made Nora's teeth ache. Through the soot-streaked window, Red Hollow looked like every other dying frontier town she'd passed through. False front buildings leaning against each other like exhausted dancers, mud streets carved into frozen ruts, and the kind of silence that meant people had learned to mind their own business. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. 28 years old, and everything she owned fit in a trunk that had belonged to her mother. That trunk had traveled from Philadelphia to Chicago to 3 different boarding houses where Nora worked herself sick trying to make rent. Now it was heading to a ranch owned by a man she'd never met, because the advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette had been brutally honest in a way that made her trust it. Seeking wife, ranch struggling, no promises of comfort, need someone who won't break. Most women would have turned the page. Nora had written back the same night. The conductor opened her compartment door without knocking. Red Hollow, miss. End of the line. I know. She stood, smoothing wrinkles from a dress she'd already worn for 2 days straight. Is there someone meeting me? Didn't see nobody. He hefted her trunk like it weighed nothing. Station master can hold your things if... I'll wait outside. The platform smelled like coal smoke and pine sap. November wind cut through her coat, the kind of cold that made you realize how far you were from anything resembling shelter. 3 other passengers hurried toward the street, collars up, not looking back. Nora set her trunk down and scanned the street. A wagon stood near the livery stable. Man sitting on the bench seat, hat pulled low, not moving. She picked up her trunk, heavy enough to make her shoulders scream, and walked toward him. He didn't look up until she was 10 feet away. You the one answering the advertisement? Nora Whitmore. Caleb Mercer. He finally raised his head, mid-30s, she guessed. Face weathered the way men's faces got when they spent more time squinting at horizon than talking to people. Eyes that looked like they'd forgotten how to expect anything good. Trunk in the back. She heaved it over the tailgate herself. He didn't offer to help. She climbed onto the bench seat. They rode in silence for 20 minutes. The town disappeared behind them, swallowed by rolling hills covered in pale grass and scattered pine. The road, if you could call it that, wound between rock outcroppings and dried creek beds. Nora watched Caleb's hands on the reins. Rough hands, scarred knuckles, the kind of hands that knew work the way some men knew whiskey. Storm coming, he said finally. She looked at the sky. Clouds massing to the west, heavy and dark. How far to the ranch? Another hour. Will we beat it? No. The first snowflakes started falling 30 minutes later, fat, wet flakes that stuck to everything. Caleb urged the horses faster, but the road got worse. Muddy, then icy, then treacherous enough that the wagon wheels slipped sideways every few yards. There, Caleb pointed ahead. Through the swirling snow, Nora saw buildings. A barn, tall and solid. Corrals with good fencing. A house that looked like it had been built by someone who knew what they were doing. Horses in the pasture, healthy-looking stock. Everything about the place screamed prosperity. Everything except Caleb's face. He pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. I'll get your trunk. Leave it. I want to see inside first. His jaw tightened. Suit yourself. The house was cold. No fire burning. No lamps lit. Caleb struck a match and touched it to a kerosene lamp on the table. Yellow light spilled across a main room that was clean but empty in a way that made Nora's chest hurt. No curtains. No rugs. Furniture that looked like it had been made by hand decades ago and never replaced. Kitchen's through there. Caleb gestured toward a doorway. Bedroom upstairs. There's a spare room if you want separate. Show me the books. He stared at her. What? Your account books, ledgers, whatever you use to track the ranch finances. She unbuttoned her coat, even though the room was freezing. The advertisement said the ranch was struggling. This place doesn't look like it's struggling. So either you lied in the ad or something else is wrong. I want to see the numbers. Most women would ask about the bedroom situation first. I'm not most women. And if this ranch is really going under, the bedroom situation won't matter because we'll both be on the street by spring. She met his eyes. Books. Now. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. Like he'd expected one thing and gotten something completely different and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. Upstairs, he said. Office next to the bedroom. The office was smaller than she'd expected. A desk buried under papers, a filing cabinet with drawers that didn't quite close, and shelves lined with ledger books going back years. Caleb lit another lamp and pulled down the most recent ledger. This is the current year. He dropped it on the desk with a thud that raised dust. But you won't understand. Try me. She opened the book. Caleb's handwriting was rough but legible. Income from cattle sales, expenses for feed and equipment, wages for ranch hands. Standard accounting, nothing unusual, except for one line that appeared every month like clockwork. Payment to V. Hale, $400. Who's V. Hale? Caleb's face went carefully blank. Partner. What kind of partner? The kind who owns 40% of this ranch, even though he's never set foot on the property. Caleb pulled down another ledger, older. My father took a loan 15 years ago to expand the herd. Victor Hale provided the capital in exchange for partial ownership and a share of profits. How much was the loan? $5,000. Nora's fingers moved down the columns, adding numbers in her head. And you've been paying $400 a month for 15 years? Yes, that's $72,000. Caleb flinched. The agreement included interest. What rate? He stopped, reached into the filing cabinet and pulled out a contract so old the paper had turned yellow. 8% annually, compounding. Nora took the contract, read it once, read it again, then pulled down every ledger on the shelf and started laying them out across the desk in chronological order. What are you doing? Caleb asked. Being quiet so I can think. She worked in silence while snow battered the windows and the lamp flame flickered. Caleb stood by the door, watching her flip pages and make notes on a scrap of paper with a pencil stub she found in the desk drawer. An hour passed, then another. Finally, Nora sat back. You've been robbed. I know the payments are high, but the contract... No. You've been robbed, systematically, for over a decade. She turned the current ledger around so he could see. Look at this. Payment to Hale in January of this year, $400. Now look at this. She pulled out a ledger from 5 years ago. Payment to Hale in January, $400. Same amount. So if the interest is compounding, the payments should be increasing every year as the principal grows. But they're not. They've been exactly $400 every month for 15 years. She grabbed another ledger, this one from 10 years back. And look at this notation here. Principal reduction of $2,000. Your father made a large payment to reduce the debt. I remember that. He sold off some timber rights. But the monthly payments didn't change. If he reduced the principal by $2,000, the interest should have dropped too. But it didn't. She spread her hands over the pile of ledgers. Someone's been charging you as if the full $5,000 is still owed, plus compounding interest, while also pocketing every extra payment your father made without adjusting the balance. Caleb's face had gone white. That's not possible. Hale sends statements every quarter showing the remaining balance. Show me. He pulled out a folder of statements. Nora compared them to the ledgers, her pencil flying across the paper as she calculated. The lamp burned lower. Outside, the storm howled like something alive. Here. She jabbed her finger at a statement from 3 years ago. This says you owed $32,000. But according to the actual payments you've made, minus the original $5,000 and reasonable interest, you should have owed less than $8,000. And here, she grabbed a more recent statement. This says you currently owe $28,000. You've been paying $400 a month for 3 years. That's $14,400. And somehow the balance only dropped $4,000? He said there were penalties for... There are no penalties listed in the contract. I read the whole thing. 8% interest, compounding annually, with payments applied first to interest and then to principal. Standard terms. But these statements, she threw them on the desk. These are complete fiction. Caleb sat down heavily in the desk chair. How much do I actually owe? Nora did the math again, checking her work twice. If we account for the original 5,015 years of 8% compound interest and subtract every payment you've made, including the large principal reduction, you don't owe anything. In fact, based on these numbers, you overpaid by approximately $3,000 8 months ago. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the crack of ice forming on the window panes.
He's been stealing from us, Caleb said quietly. From my father. From me. Yes. For 15 years. Yes. Caleb stood up so fast the chair fell over. He paced to the window, hands clenched. My father died thinking he'd left me nothing but debt. He worked himself into the ground trying to keep this place afloat. And all along, his voice cracked. All along we were paying for something we'd already paid off.
Nora organized the ledgers into neat stacks. The question is what you want to do about it. I want to kill him. That's one option. It would also get you hanged. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper. Better option is to prove what he did and force him to return the money. Caleb turned from the window. Victor Hale is the richest man in 3 territories. He has lawyers, connections, politicians in his pocket. Who's going to believe a struggling rancher over him? The territorial court if we can show them evidence. Nora tapped the ledgers. This is evidence. These books have been kept for 15 years. Every payment is documented. Every statement from Hale is preserved. If we organize it correctly and present it properly, it's not about belief. It's about arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how rich you are. You don't know what you're talking about. Hale has destroyed bigger operations than mine. There was a family over in Stone Creek, the Hendersons. They claimed Hale cheated them too. Within 6 months, their ranch burned down, their livestock died of mysterious illness, and they left with nothing. People don't cross Victor Hale and survive. Nora looked at him steadily. Then maybe it's time someone did. This isn't a game. If Hale finds out we're questioning the agreements, he already knows something's wrong, or he wouldn't be coming here. Caleb went very still. What? You got a letter 3 days ago, didn't you, saying Hale was coming to inspect the property? She gestured at the pile of papers on the desk. It was mixed in with these statements. I saw it when I was looking for the contract. How did you? I can read, and I pay attention. She stood up. He's coming because something's made him nervous. Maybe other people have started asking questions. Maybe someone at the territorial office noticed the numbers don't add up. Whatever the reason, he's coming here to make sure you stay in line, which means we have very little time. To do what? To build a case so strong he can't threaten his way out of it. She started gathering the ledgers. I need to see every contract, every statement, every piece of correspondence between your family and Hale. I need the names of anyone else who's done business with him. And I need you to tell me everything you know about how he operates. Caleb stared at her like she'd sprouted wings. You've been here for 2 hours and you want to take on the most dangerous man in the territory? I want to survive. This ranch is my survival now too. If Hale destroys you, I'm destroyed with you. So yes, I want to take him on. She met his eyes. Unless you prefer to just hand him the property and walk away? This land has been in my family for 40 years. Then help me save it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the filing cabinet and started pulling out folders. Everything from Hale is in here. Contracts, statements, letters. There's also correspondence from my father's lawyer, though he died 5 years ago. Who else has Hale done business with? Half the ranchers in this valley at one point or another. Most of them are gone now. He dropped a stack of folders on the desk. The Hendersons I mentioned, the Pritchard family lost their place 3 years ago. The Kowalskis left last spring. All of them had arrangements with Hale. Do you know where they went? Henderson moved to Denver last I heard. Pritchard might be in Cheyenne. The Kowalskis, I don't know. They just disappeared. Nora pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and started making a list. We need to find them, get their stories, see if Hale used the same methods on them. That could take weeks. Hale's coming in 4 days. Then we work fast. She looked up at him. Can you ride out tomorrow and ask around? See if anyone knows how to reach these families? In this storm? The storm will break by morning, and we don't have time to wait. She organized the folders by date. I'll stay here and go through all of this, build a timeline, document every suspicious transaction. Caleb sat down on the edge of the desk. Why are you doing this? I told you, it's my survival too.
No. You could leave. Get back on that train and find another advertisement, another desperate man who'd be grateful just to have someone willing to show up. He gestured at the ledgers. This isn't your fight. Nora was quiet for a moment. I spent 10 years working for people who thought I was too stupid to notice when they cheated me on wages. I smiled while they shorted my pay, stole my tips, blamed me for their mistakes, because I needed the job and they knew it. She looked at the numbers spread across the desk. I'm tired of letting people steal from me because I'm supposed to be too weak or too scared to fight back. And I'm tired of running. So no, I'm not leaving. I'm staying and I'm fighting. And if Hale wants this ranch, he's going to have to go through me to get it. Something changed in Caleb's expression. You really mean that? Every word. He nodded slowly. All right. I'll ride out at first light. But if this goes wrong, it won't. You don't know that. No. But I know I'm good with numbers, and I know Hale got sloppy because he thought no one would ever check his math. She pulled the lamp closer. Now go get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment like he wanted to say something else. Then he just nodded and left. Nora worked through the night. She organized contracts by date, cross-referenced statements with payment records, and built a spreadsheet showing every transaction between the Mercer family and Victor Hale over 15 years. The numbers told a story of systematic theft disguised as legitimate business. But they also told another story, one that made her blood run cold. The Hendersons' contract was in the files. So was one from the Pritchards. Both showed the same pattern: reasonable initial terms, compounding interest that never seemed to decrease the principal, and eventually foreclosure when the families couldn't keep up with payments that should have been finished years earlier. Hale wasn't just robbing the Mercers. He'd been running the same scheme across the entire valley, using complex accounting to hide theft under the veneer of legitimate lending. Dawn light was seeping through the windows when Caleb came downstairs. He'd shaved and changed clothes, but his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept. Coffee? He asked. Please. He made coffee in silence, brought her a cup without asking how she took it. She drank it black and bitter, grateful for the warmth. Find anything? He asked. She showed him the spreadsheet. He's done this to at least 4 other families. Same pattern every time. The contracts look legitimate, but the accounting is designed to trap people in endless debt. Caleb studied the numbers. How is this legal? It's not, but it's complicated enough that most people don't understand they're being cheated until it's too late. And by then, they're too afraid to fight back. Exactly. She took another sip of coffee, which is why we need testimony from the other families. If we can show this is a pattern, not a mistake, it becomes fraud, criminal fraud, which the territorial court takes seriously. She pulled out her list of names. Can you find the Hendersons and Pritchards? I can try. Denver's a big city, though. Start with the last address you have. Send telegrams if you have to. She handed him a carefully worded message. Don't mention Hale's name, just say you're trying to reach them about old business from Red Hollow. If they're willing to talk, they'll understand. Caleb pocketed the paper. What will you do? Keep building the case. There's still a lot of documentation to go through, she hesitated. Also, I need to know exactly when Hale is arriving. His letter said Friday afternoon. 3 days. She chewed her lip. Not much time. No. Caleb pulled on his coat. I'll be back by tomorrow night. There's food in the pantry and wood for the stove. Lock the doors. You think someone might come? I think Hale didn't get rich by being careless. If he suspects we're digging into his business, he might send someone to make sure we don't find anything. He checked his revolver, then holstered it. Just lock the doors. He left as the sun broke over the eastern hills. Nora watched him ride away, then turned back to the ocean of paper covering the desk. She worked methodically, the way she'd learned working for accountants in Philadelphia. Every contract got summarized. Every payment got verified. Every discrepancy got highlighted and annotated. By noon, she'd processed half the files and confirmed her initial assessment. Hale had been systematically defrauding the Mercers for over a decade, but she'd also found something else. Buried in a folder from 12 years ago was a letter from Caleb's father to his lawyer. The handwriting was shaky.
An old man's hand, or maybe just exhaustion. Mr. Patterson, I write to you in confidence regarding the arrangement with Mr. Hale. The payments continue to increase despite my efforts to reduce the principal, and I fear I do not understand the mathematics involved. My son tells me this is normal for compound interest, but something feels wrong. Could you review the contract and advise if we have any recourse? I'm ashamed to admit I may have made a terrible mistake. There was a response from the lawyer dated 2 weeks later. Mr. Mercer, I have reviewed your contract with Mr. Hale. While the terms are aggressive, I find nothing technically illegal. Compound interest can indeed result in payments that seem never to decrease the principal, particularly if the interest rate is high. My advice is to continue making payments as agreed and avoid antagonizing Mr. Hale, as he is a powerful man with considerable influence. I'm sorry I cannot offer better news. Nora read both letters twice. Caleb's father had known something was wrong. He'd tried to get help. But the lawyer, either incompetent or afraid, had told him to just keep paying. And now Caleb's father was dead, probably still thinking he'd failed his son. She folded the letters carefully and set them aside. Then she went back to work with renewed fury. By the time darkness fell again, she'd documented 37 separate instances of fraudulent accounting across 5 different contracts. She'd calculated the total amount Hale had stolen, over $200,000 from 5 families combined, and she'd drafted a formal complaint to the territorial court that laid out the entire scheme in language clear enough for any judge to understand. All she needed now was testimony from the victims. Caleb returned the next evening, covered in trail dust and looking exhausted, but his eyes were sharp when he dismounted. I found Henderson. Nora set down her pen. And? He's willing to talk. So is Pritchard. I sent a telegram and got a response an hour later. Caleb pulled out a stack of papers. They both kept copies of their contracts and statements. Henderson sending his by express post. Should arrive tomorrow. What did they say about Hale? Caleb's jaw tightened. Henderson said he tried to fight the foreclosure, hired a lawyer, filed a complaint. 2 weeks later, his barn burned down with 30 head of cattle inside. The lawyer dropped the case the next day. And Pritchard? His youngest daughter got sick right after he started asking questions about the payments. Doctor said it looked like poison, but couldn't prove anything. Pritchard signed the property over to Hale and left town the same week. Nora felt something cold settle in her stomach. So Hale doesn't just steal. He terrorizes. He does whatever it takes to protect his business, which is why... Caleb stopped. Started again. Look, I brought back the information you wanted, but maybe we should reconsider this. If Hale burned down Henderson's barn and poisoned Pritchard's daughter just for asking questions, what do you think he'll do to us? I think he'll try to scare us into submission. And I think if we let him, we'll end up just like those families, broken and scattered, and blaming ourselves for not fighting harder. She stood up. I'm not running, Caleb, but I need to know if you are. Because if you want out, say so now. I won't blame you. He looked at her for a long time. You're the stubbornest woman I've ever met. Is that a yes or a no? It's a yes. He crossed to the desk and looked at the documentation she'd compiled. What do we do when Hale gets here? We show him this. She gestured at the organized evidence. All of it. Every fraudulent transaction, every stolen dollar, every manipulated statement. We show him we know exactly what he's done. He'll deny it, probably, but he'll also know we have enough evidence to destroy him if we take it to the territorial court. She pulled out the formal complaint. I've already drafted the filing. All we need is Henderson's and Pritchard's testimony, and we can submit this tomorrow. Before Hale arrives. Exactly. Once the court has it, he can't threaten us into silence. The investigation will proceed whether we're alive or dead. Caleb went pale. You really think he'd kill us? I think a man who's stolen $200,000 and gotten away with it for 15 years will do whatever he thinks is necessary to keep that secret. She met his eyes, which is why we need to make sure the secret's already out before he gets here. Once other people know, killing us won't help him. You've thought this through. I've thought about nothing else for 2 days. She organized the papers into a leather portfolio. Tomorrow morning, I'm riding to the territorial courthouse to file this complaint. You're staying here to wait for Henderson's documents. When they arrive, bring them to me immediately. If Hale shows up early, I'll stall him. No, you'll tell him I'm at the courthouse filing fraud charges, and he can find me there if he wants to discuss it. She handed him a copy of the complaint. Don't threaten him. Don't argue. Just tell him where I am and let him make the next move. You want him to come to the courthouse?
I want him to know he's lost before he ever tries to fight. Men like Hale, they're used to having all the power. Take that away from them in public, where they can't intimidate or threaten, and they crumble. She closed the portfolio. Trust me. I don't have much choice, do I? No, but for what it's worth, she paused. I won't let him take this ranch. I promise you that. Caleb studied her face. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest. Can I be both?
The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. Yeah, I guess you can. That night, Nora slept for 3 hours on the couch downstairs, the portfolio of evidence clutched against her chest like armor. When she woke before dawn, Caleb was already up, making coffee. Ready? He asked. No, but I'm going anyway. She accepted the coffee cup. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen. If something happens to me, she continued, there's a copy of everything in the bottom drawer of the desk. Take it to the territorial marshal. His name is Samuel Cross. Tell him I sent you. You know the territorial marshal? I met him once, years ago. He helped me when a boarding house owner tried to keep my wages. He's honest, which means he's probably the only law enforcement in this territory Hale doesn't own. She finished her coffee. Just remember, Cross. Samuel Cross. Caleb nodded. Be careful. You too. She rode toward town as the sun rose, the portfolio strapped to her saddle, her heart hammering against her ribs. The territorial courthouse was a day's ride from the ranch. If she pushed hard, she could file the complaint and be back before dark, if Hale didn't catch her first. The road was empty except for wind and scattered snow. Nora kept the horse at a steady pace, watching the horizon for any sign of pursuit, but nothing moved except ravens and the occasional deer. She reached the courthouse just after noon. It was a squat brick building that looked like it had been built to withstand sieges. She tied her horse and carried the portfolio inside. The clerk was an older man with spectacles and the ink-stained fingers. Help you? I need to file a formal complaint of fraud with the territorial court. He looked up from his paperwork. Criminal or civil? Criminal. Against whom? Victor Hale. The clerk's pen stopped moving. Excuse me? Victor Hale. I have documentation of systematic fraud spanning 15 years, involving 5 families and over $200,000 in stolen assets. She opened the portfolio and placed the complaint on his desk. This is the formal filing. The supporting evidence is here. The clerk stared at the papers like they might bite him. Miss, do you understand who you're accusing? Completely. Victor Hale is a thief, which is why I'm filing charges. She kept her voice steady. Is there a problem? He glanced toward a closed door at the back of the room. I need to get the judge. Please do. He disappeared through the door. Nora stood alone in the quiet office, listening to the clock tick on the wall and her own heartbeat thunder in her ears. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the door opened. The clerk returned, followed by a silver-haired man in a black suit. I'm Judge Carver, the man said. You're filing fraud charges against Victor Hale? Yes, sir. On what grounds? Nora laid out the evidence methodically, showed him the contracts, the payment records, the manipulated statements, explained the pattern of compound interest that never decreased principal. Presented Henderson's and Pritchard's correspondence confirming similar schemes. Judge Carver listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down at the clerk's desk and read through the complaint himself, line by line. This is thorough, he said finally. Thank you. It's also incredibly dangerous. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong. The mathematics don't lie. Mathematics can be interpreted in different ways. Not these. These are simple addition and subtraction. Money paid, money owed, interest calculated. There's no interpretation required. She pulled out the spreadsheet she'd created. Here, every transaction for 15 years. The numbers speak for themselves. Judge Carver studied the spreadsheet. Where did you get this information? The Mercer family ranch. Caleb Mercer's father kept meticulous records. And you are? Nora Whitmore. She hesitated. I'm Caleb Mercer's fiancée. I see. The judge set down the papers. Miss Whitmore, I'm going to be direct with you.
Victor Hale has powerful friends. If I accept this complaint, there will be significant pressure on this court to dismiss it. Will you accept it anyway? He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, because if what you're alleging is true, it's one of the largest fraud cases this territory has ever seen. And because, he gestured at the evidence, because this is too well documented to ignore. Nora felt something in her chest loosen. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Filing charges is just the first step. We'll need witnesses, testimony, and time for a proper investigation. Can you provide all of that? Yes. Even if Hale tries to intimidate you into dropping the charges? Yes. Judge Carver nodded slowly. Then I'll accept your complaint and open an official investigation. The clerk will give you a receipt. Keep it somewhere safe. He stood. And Miss Whitmore, be very careful. Men who steal $200,000 don't usually let accusations like this go unanswered. I know. She left the courthouse with the receipt folded in her pocket, and the weight of what she'd just done settling on her shoulders like iron. There was no going back now. Hale would know within hours that she'd filed charges. The question was what he'd do about it. The ride back to the ranch took longer than the ride out. Her horse was tired and storm clouds were gathering again. Nora pushed as hard as she dared, but darkness fell before she reached home. She saw the lights of the ranch house from a mile away. Too many lights. Her stomach clenched. Someone was there. She approached slowly, hand on the small revolver Caleb had insisted she carry. 3 horses tied outside. 1 she recognized as Caleb's, 2 she didn't. She dismounted quietly and crept toward the house. Voices inside. Men's voices, raised and angry. Nora eased the door open. Caleb stood in the center of the room, flanked by 2 men she'd never seen before. Big men with hard faces and guns on their hips. And sitting at the desk, calmly reviewing the ledgers she'd left out, was a man in an expensive suit who could only be Victor Hale. He looked up when she entered. Miss Whitmore, I presume. She closed the door behind her. Mr. Hale, I hear you've been very busy. He gestured at the papers on the desk. Quite an impressive investigation. Thank you. It's also completely wrong. He stood, smoothing his jacket. These ledgers are complex. It's understandable that someone without proper accounting training might misinterpret them. I didn't misinterpret anything. You've been stealing from the Mercer family for 15 years using fraudulent accounting practices. One of the men by Caleb shifted his weight. Caleb didn't move, but his eyes flicked to Nora in warning. Hale smiled. Those are serious accusations. I filed them with the territorial court this afternoon. Judge Carver opened an official investigation. The smile disappeared. You what? You heard me. Nora walked to the desk and pulled out the receipt. Criminal fraud charges. Backed by 15 years of documentation and testimony from multiple victims. The investigation starts Monday. Hale's face went very still. You had no right. I had every right. You're a thief, Mr. Hale, and thieves belong in prison. The silence that followed was so complete that Nora could hear her own heartbeat. Then Hale laughed. It was a cold sound, empty of humor. You stupid girl. You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done. I've ended your little empire. My empire, as you call it, includes half the territorial legislature and most of the judges in this district. Do you really think one complaint from a rancher's mail-order bride is going to change anything? I think Judge Carver isn't one of your judges, and I think once this investigation is public, every family you've robbed will come forward. You can't intimidate all of us. Hale stepped closer. Can't I? Caleb moved between them. Get out of my house. This isn't your house, Hale said quietly. According to our contract, I own 40% of this property, which means I have every right to be here. According to the actual mathematics, you own nothing because the loan was paid off years ago. Nora didn't back down. The investigation will prove that. And when it does, you'll be returning every dollar you stole plus interest. Or you'll be in prison, probably both. Hale stared at her. You're making a mistake. No, you made the mistake. You got greedy and sloppy, and now you're caught. For a moment, she thought he might lunge at her. His hands clenched, his face flushed. Then he took a breath and smoothed his expression back to cold politeness. Very well, if you want to play this out in court, we'll play it out in court. But I promise you,
He leaned closer. You will regret this. We'll see. Hale gestured to his men. They filed out without a word. Hale paused at the door. I'll be back, he said. Soon. Then he was gone. Caleb locked the door behind them and leaned against it. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen. Nora's hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with her. He's scared. He's furious. Same thing for men like him. She sat down before her legs gave out. Did Henderson's documents arrive? Yes, they're on the desk. They match your analysis exactly. Caleb crossed the room. But Nora, Hale threatened you. He threatened us. We should prepare for war, because that's what this is now. She looked at the evidence spread across the desk. He knows he's cornered, which makes him dangerous, but it also means we've already won. He just doesn't realize it yet. Caleb shook his head slowly. You're either going to save this ranch or get us both killed. Preferably the first one. Preferably. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Snow and wind battered the windows. Inside, Nora and Caleb sat together in the lamplight, surrounded by evidence of 15 years of theft, and prepared for whatever Victor Hale would do next. Neither of them slept that night. They knew the real fight was just beginning. The storm lasted 3 days. Snow piled against the windows until they couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the glass, and the wind screamed like something trapped and furious. Nora barely noticed. She'd stopped sleeping in beds and started sleeping at the desk, her head resting on stacks of documents, waking every few hours to add more notes to the case file. Caleb brought her coffee at dawn on the second day. She was still wearing the same dress she'd arrived in, though she'd borrowed one of his shirts to wear over it when the house got too cold. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung down her back in tangles she hadn't bothered to fix. You look like hell, he said. Feel worse. She accepted the coffee without looking up from the ledger she was reading. Have you thought about what happens after the investigation? After we win? If we win. If the judge actually presses charges. If Hale doesn't find some way to make the evidence disappear. She took a sip of coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. Men like him don't lose gracefully, Caleb. They fight. And when fighting doesn't work, they destroy. I know. Do you? Because I don't think you do. She finally looked at him. I spent years in Philadelphia working for businessmen who thought rules didn't apply to them. I saw what happened to people who got in their way. They didn't always get arrested. Sometimes they just disappeared, got sick, lost everything in accidents. People have short memories when the alternative is getting hurt. Caleb sat down in the chair across from her. You're trying to scare me into backing out. I'm trying to make sure you understand what we're actually doing. We're not just filing a complaint with the court. We're declaring war on a man who's used to winning every single fight. She pushed the coffee away. If you want to drop this, if you want to apologize to Hale and try to negotiate some kind of deal, I won't stop you. You'd drop it too? No, I'd keep going alone if I had to. Caleb studied her face. You mean that? Completely. Why? She was quiet for a long moment. Because I spent my whole life being invisible. Cheap labor. Someone people could use and discard without thinking twice. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being afraid. And I'm tired of watching people like Hale steal from people like you and just get away with it because nobody's brave enough or stupid enough to say no. Which are you, brave or stupid? Still figuring that out. He smiled despite everything. Well, you're not doing this alone. Whatever comes next, we're in it together. You should make sure you mean that. Really mean it. I do. The third day, the storm broke. The sun came out over white mountains and blinding snow. By evening, the roads would be passable, which meant people could move again, which meant Hale could move again. The telegram arrived the next morning, delivered by a boy who looked about 12 and was terrified of the house for reasons he couldn't articulate. Nora tipped him with a coin and opened the thin envelope with shaking hands. Pritchard can testify. Leaving Cheyenne Friday. Will arrive Red Hollow. Monday. Henderson says come yourself if possible. Evidence he wants to show you. Pritchard. Caleb read it over her shoulder. He's coming. They're coming. Both of them. Nora set the telegram down carefully. Monday. That gives us the weekend to prepare. We need to organize everything the judge will ask for. Witness statements, chronological documentation, a summary that even someone who doesn't understand accounting can follow. You mean in case Hale's lawyers try to confuse the issue? In case he tries everything, which he will. She started gathering papers. We need to ride to town and meet with Judge Carver. Get his advice on how to structure the evidence for maximum impact. They rode into Red Hollow that afternoon. The town looked exactly like it had a week ago, half awake, full of people who'd learned not to ask questions about things that might get them hurt. But something had changed. People watched them pass. A few met their eyes. Others quickly looked away. News traveled fast in small towns. Judge Carver's office was above the general store. His clerk, the same nervous man who'd accepted the original complaint, went pale when they walked in. "The judge isn't," he started. "Get him." Caleb's voice was quiet, but carried an edge Nora hadn't heard before. The judge appeared a moment later, looking like he'd been expecting them. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Mercer, come in." His office was lined with law books and the smell of old paper and ink. He settled behind his desk and gestured for them to sit. "I've received 3 inquiries about your complaint," he said without preamble. 2 from lawyers representing Mr. Hale. 1 from a territorial senator who wanted me to understand how much Mr. Hale contributes to our community. "What did you tell him?" Nora asked. "That fraud is fraud, regardless of the perpetrator's prior charitable contributions." He folded his hands on his desk. "I also received a visit from a gentleman who didn't introduce himself. He suggested that if I wanted to retire comfortably, I might consider recusing myself from this case." "Are you going to?" Caleb asked. "No. But I'm also going to be honest with you both. The pressure is going to increase, significantly." Judge Carver looked directly at Nora. "People will be watching you. Hale will be looking for any reason to discredit you or your evidence. If there's anything in your past that could be weaponized, there isn't." "Are you sure?" She thought about the boarding houses, the men who'd tried to take advantage, the wages she'd had to fight for. None of it was scandalous, but all of it was ammunition in the right hands. "Nothing that matters. Everything matters," the judge said quietly. "Hale's lawyers will be looking through your life with microscopes. They'll find inconsistencies, exaggerations, anything they can use to suggest you're unreliable. That's how this works. Then I'll make sure everything I tell you is airtight." She pulled out her documentation. "I've organized the evidence by family and by type of fraud. I have payment records, contract analysis, comparative statements showing the mathematical impossibility of the balances. I have testimony from 2 family heads who were victimized by the same scheme. And I have this." She pulled out Caleb's father's letter and the lawyer's response. "What is this?" the judge asked. "Proof that Hale's fraud has been going on for at least 15 years. Proof that educated people suspected something was wrong but didn't pursue it because they were afraid. And proof that one man, a lawyer named Patterson, had the opportunity to stop this years ago and chose not to." Judge Carver read both letters carefully. "Where's Patterson now?" "Dead. 5 years. But his firm still exists, and the current partners will have to account for why their predecessor ignored a potential fraud case." The judge set the letters down. "This is good. This is very good. But I need to warn you about something." He leaned back in his chair. "Hale will use every legal tactic available to delay, obfuscate, and complicate this case. He'll file motions to suppress evidence. He'll challenge the court's authority to investigate. He'll claim the documentation is incomplete or illegally obtained, and if legal tactics don't work, he'll try something else," Nora finished. "Yes, I'm aware of the risks." "Are you aware that accepting those risks means accepting the possibility that you might be hurt? That Mr. Mercer might be hurt? That this could end very differently than you're imagining?" Nora and Caleb exchanged a glance. "We're aware," she said. The judge studied them both for a long moment. "Then we proceed. Bring me Henderson when he arrives. I want to take his testimony formally, under oath, so Hale's lawyers can't claim he's biased. Same with Pritchard. If we can establish a pattern of similar fraud against multiple families, it becomes almost impossible to argue this was a simple accounting error." "When will the investigation be official?" Caleb asked. "It already is. I filed the paperwork yesterday. The territorial marshal has been informed. They'll want to question you both, probably Hale as well." Judge Carver stood. "For what it's worth,
I think what you're doing is brave. It's also going to be the hardest thing either of you have ever done. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The sun was setting orange and violent behind the mountains. Snow crunched under the horses' hooves. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled.
"We should hire help," Caleb said finally. "Men to watch the property. Make sure Hale doesn't try anything stupid." "With what money?" "I still have some savings. Nothing major, but no." Nora shook her head. "If we hire armed men, it looks like we're expecting violence. It looks like we're the ones who are concerned about what might happen. I want this to stay in the court. I want everything about this to be legal and documented and impossible for anyone to claim is unfair. Even if Hale tries to burn the house down, even then, you're insane." "Probably." The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. Nora organized the evidence into labeled files that the judge could easily reference during testimony. Caleb rode to neighboring ranches and quietly collected any records of business dealings with Hale. Old promissory notes, contracts, payment stubs, anything that might corroborate the pattern. He came back Sunday afternoon with saddlebags full of documentation and a grim expression. "I found 4 more families who dealt with Hale," he said, dropping the bags on the desk. 3 of them have already lost their properties. The 4th one, the Kowalskis, they just got a foreclosure notice. Payments due tomorrow. Nora felt her stomach drop. "Can we stop it?" "Not legally, not in time." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "But I sent them a telegram, told them about the investigation, told them they might want to hold off on accepting the terms of the foreclosure until after we've presented evidence to the court." "What did they say?" "That they need the money to leave town. They're packing up to go to California in the morning." He sat down heavily. "We're too late for them, Nora. This investigation will take months. Hale will destroy a dozen more families before it's done." "No, he won't." She pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. "Because we're going to go public. Tomorrow, before Pritchard arrives. Before the hearing. We're going to tell people exactly what Hale has been doing." "How?" "The newspaper. Red Hollow's got one, doesn't it?" "The Gazette. But they won't publish anything about Hale without proof. He owns half their advertisers." "Then we give them proof." She kept writing. "We give them the summary of the case, the numbers, the names of the families he's victimized. We tell them an official investigation is underway, and we ask any other victims to come forward." Caleb stared at her. "That's going to make Hale furious." "Good. Fury makes people careless." She finished the letter and read it aloud. It was clear, factual, and absolutely damning. It laid out 15 years of systematic fraud in language a farmer could understand. It listed the families who'd been victimized. It named Victor Hale as a predator who used legal documents and mathematical manipulation to steal from desperate people. And it ended with a call for anyone else who'd been cheated to come forward. They rode into town at dawn Monday and went straight to the Gazette office. The editor was a thin man named Hutchins, who looked like he'd swallowed a lemon and never quite recovered. "I can't print this," he said immediately, pushing the letter back across his desk. "Why not?" Nora asked. "Because it's an accusation of criminal fraud against one of the most powerful men in this territory. That's why it should be printed. The public has a right to know." "The public has a right to know lots of things." Hutchins stood, signaling they were done. "But I've got a business to run. I've got a family. I can't afford to cross Victor Hale. He's stealing from people." "Then let the courts deal with it." "The courts are dealing with it. But meanwhile, people are losing their homes, real people. The Kowalskis are leaving town today because they think they have no choice. The Mercers would have lost this ranch if Nora hadn't caught the fraud. How many more families is Hale going to destroy before his name gets printed in this newspaper?" Hutchins looked away. "That's not my responsibility." Caleb's voice went very quiet. "Then I guess we'll have to print it ourselves." They walked out without waiting for a response. It was only when they were back on the street that Nora realized what he'd said. "The printing press," she said. "There's one at the schoolhouse. The teacher uses it for the school announcements." Caleb pulled her toward the general store. "Supplies should be here." The teacher was a woman named Miss Graves, who couldn't have been more than 5 years older than Nora. She took one look at the letter and started gathering materials without asking questions. "This is the right thing," she said quietly, pulling out ink and paper. "I've heard the rumors about Hale. I've watched families disappear. My own father lost money to him years ago. She set up the press with quick, efficient movements. This ends him. It took 3 hours to lay out the type and run off 200 copies. When it was done, they stacked the papers in burlap bags and loaded them into the wagon. "What are you going to do with them?" Miss Graves asked. "Everything," Nora said. "Every building in town, every ranch within 5 miles. I want everyone to know what Hale's been doing." By noon, Red Hollow had read the accusation. By 2 o'clock, people were talking about it in the streets. By 3 o'clock, Hale's lawyers had arrived at Judge Carver's office, demanding the charges be dropped and Nora arrested for libel. But the message had spread further. Within hours, telegrams arrived at the territorial marshal's office from 3 different counties. More victims coming forward. More evidence waiting to be examined. The investigation went from a small local dispute to a full territorial scandal in the space of 6 hours. Pritchard arrived that evening, a lean man with haunted eyes and a leather satchel full of documents. Henderson came the next day, riding hard like he'd been chased. Both men looked terrified and determined in equal measure. "I didn't think anyone else would fight," Pritchard said, sitting in the Mercer house and looking at the organized evidence spread across the desk. "I thought it was just me, that I was the only one Hale had gotten to." "He got to all of us," Henderson said bitterly, "but we all thought we were the only ones stupid enough to fall for it." That wasn't true, and Nora said so. "He's good at what he does. He uses legitimate contracts and real business practices to hide the theft. He counts on people being too ashamed or too scared to check the math. And he's right most of the time. Most people trust because questioning costs too much." "What changed with you?" Pritchard asked. "I didn't have anything left to lose," Nora said simply. "I was already at the bottom. Hale couldn't threaten me with ruin because I was already ruined. And I was good at numbers. It's all I've ever been good at." Over the next week, Caleb and Henderson rode across the territory gathering more evidence. More victims came forward. The story grew bigger with each passing day, a massive fraud that had victimized dozens of families across multiple counties. The territorial marshal officially arrested Hale on Wednesday evening, and he was held in the county jail pending trial. But his lawyers filed motion after motion to delay proceedings. They challenged the evidence as illegally obtained. They questioned Judge Carver's impartiality. They demanded more time to prepare a defense. The trial date, scheduled for December, was pushed back to February. Nora watched the delays accumulate with growing frustration. "He's stalling," she told Caleb one night as they sat by the fire. "He's trying to wear us down, make us run out of money for travel, make us second-guess ourselves, make us give up." "Are you going to?" "No, but people like Pritchard and Henderson might. They have families, they have jobs they've had to leave. They can't sit around waiting for justice forever." Caleb shifted closer to her. "What do you need?" "Money. Enough to pay for their accommodations, their travel, their living expenses for however long this takes. I need—" She stopped. "I need something I don't have." "You have me." She looked at him. They'd spent 5 weeks together, almost entirely focused on the case. She'd helped him fix a fence one afternoon when the ranch hand got sick. He'd brought her hot food when she'd forgotten to eat, sitting quietly while she worked through the evidence. Somewhere in the chaos and fear and urgency, something had shifted between them. "That's not nothing," she said finally. "No, it's not." He reached over and took her hand. His palm was calloused, his grip gentle. She'd seen his hands holding documents, making notes, trying to build a life. She'd watched him stand down his fear and choose to fight anyway. "I'm not the woman you expected to marry," she said. "No, you're better than that." "You don't know that yet. We barely know each other. I know you've got more courage than any person I've ever met. I know you don't break when things get hard. And I know you care about doing the right thing more than you care about being safe." He squeezed her hand. "That's enough." The next morning, she wrote letters to the families, explained the delays, promised that the case would proceed and Hale would face justice, and offered them what little money she and Caleb could spare to help them wait. 3 of them accepted. 1, the Kowalskis, had already left for California. Too much damage, too much lost time, but 3 was better than none. The weeks crept into months. Judge Carver began hearings in late January, taking testimony from the victims. Each story followed the same brutal pattern. Hale had offered loans at seemingly reasonable rates. The contracts were complex but legally sound, but the accounting had been manipulated, the interest calculated in ways that seemed legitimate but mathematically led to endless debt. Pritchard testified first. His voice shook as he described losing the family ranch, watching his youngest daughter recover slowly from an illness that the doctor still couldn't fully explain. "He destroyed our home," Pritchard said, his hands clenched so hard his knuckles went white. "Not with violence, with papers and numbers and words. And that almost hurt worse because I couldn't fight it. How do you fight a number?" Henderson testified next. He'd lost his ranch but kept his pride. He laid out the evidence methodically, showing exactly how Hale had manipulated the interest calculations and hidden payment allocations. His voice never wavered, but his eyes were haunted. "I trusted him," Henderson said. "That was my mistake. I thought he was a businessman, not a thief. But there's no difference, is there? He stole just as much as if he'd held a gun to my head. The only difference is he did it with a pen." Nora testified for 3 days. She walked through every fraudulent transaction, every mathematical impossibility, every piece of evidence. Hale's lawyers tried to confuse her with technical questions, to make her doubt her own analysis. But she'd spent her entire life with numbers. She didn't waver. "The money either adds up or it doesn't," she said, when one lawyer tried to suggest her calculations were open to interpretation. "These don't add up. They've never added up." Mr. Hale knew they didn't add up, which is why he manipulated them so carefully. But they still don't add up. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Hale sat at the defendant's table with his expensive lawyers, looking increasingly less like a confident businessman and more like a cornered animal. By the time the hearings concluded in early February, it was clear to everyone in the valley what had happened. Victor Hale had stolen from desperate people. He'd hidden the theft under layers of complex accounting, and when those people had tried to fight back, he'd intimidated them into silence. But he hadn't counted on Nora Whitmore, who'd arrived on a train carrying nothing but a trunk and the kind of desperation that turns into courage when given half a chance. The judge's ruling came on a cold afternoon in February. Guilty on all counts. Restitution ordered to the victims in the amount of $217,000. Hale was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. When Judge Carver read the verdict, something in Nora's chest that had been wound tight since the day she arrived in Red Hollow finally let go. She looked at Caleb across the courtroom. He was crying, silent tears running down his face. Around them, other victims wept, some with relief, some with the bitter knowledge that money could never truly make them whole again. But justice had been done, and that had to be enough. The celebration lasted exactly one evening. Caleb bought a bottle of whiskey from the general store, the good kind, not the rot gut they kept behind the bar for drifters, and he and Nora sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the stars come out over the mountains. Pritchard and Henderson had already started making arrangements to travel home. Judge Carver had shaken Nora's hand outside the courthouse in a way that said more than he could afford to say publicly. Even Hutchins, the newspaper editor who'd refused to print their letter, had sent a note congratulating them on the verdict. The whiskey was warm going down. The night was cold enough to see their breath. "My father would have liked you," Caleb said. He was staring out at the dark pastures where his horses moved like shadows. "He would have argued with you constantly, but he would have liked you." What was he like? Stubborn, proud, didn't know when to ask for help. He poured another measure into her tin cup. He spent his whole life fighting for this land and never once complained about how hard it was. Even at the end, when we both knew the debt was going to swallow everything, he just kept working, like if he stopped moving, he'd have to admit defeat. Nora wrapped both hands around the cup. He didn't fail. He was robbed. I know that now. Caleb's voice went rough. Took me a while to stop being angry at him for not seeing it. You were angry at him? For a long time. Thought he'd made bad decisions? Thought he'd been careless with money he worked his whole life to earn? He shook his head. I wasn't fair to him. He wasn't fair to himself either. He suspected something was wrong. Said so in that letter. But he didn't trust his own instincts enough to push harder. Nora looked at the mountains. People do that, especially when they're scared. They convince themselves that if a paper says something official, it must be right, that the other person must know something they don't. Is that what happened to you in Philadelphia? She was quiet a moment. Different version of the same thing. Men who told me I was lucky to have work, that I should be grateful, that if I complained, there were 10 other women who'd take my place and be happy about it. She took a sip. I believed them for a long time. Smiled and kept my head down. Told myself it was temporary, that I was working toward something better. When did that change? When I added up 3 months of wages and realized I was still behind on rent, and I'd worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. She turned to look at him. I started actually looking at the numbers instead of just trusting what I was told, and the numbers were a completely different story than the one I'd been sold. Caleb nodded. Same lesson, different classroom. Same lesson, she agreed. They sat without talking for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that comes between people who've been through something hard together and don't need to fill every quiet moment with noise. The fire in the house crackled behind them. Somewhere down by the creek, an owl called. But the morning came hard, and with it came problems that the verdict hadn't solved. The restitution order was one thing on paper and something entirely different in practice. Hale's lawyers filed for a stay of payment while they appealed the verdict. His assets, the land he'd seized, the money he'd accumulated, were frozen pending the appeal, which meant the families who were owed money might wait months, possibly years, before seeing a single dollar. Nora found out about the appeal from Judge Carver's clerk, who stopped by the ranch on his way to the telegraph office. She was mending a fence post when she heard it, and her first instinct was to put the hammer through something. Instead, she drove the nail home and walked back to the house. Caleb was inside doing the books. Real books. Honest ones. The version that finally reflected what the ranch actually owed and what it actually earned. He'd been doing them every morning since the verdict, like a man checking a healed wound to make sure it wasn't infected. He appealed, she said. Caleb set down his pen. When? Yesterday, apparently. His lawyers argued that the evidence was circumstantially compiled and that the judge was biased. She sat down across from him. The restitution's on hold until the appeal is heard. He was very still for a moment. Then he picked up his pen again. How long? Could be 6 months, could be more. So the Hendersons and Pritchards get nothing for at least 6 months. Yes. He pressed the pen so hard against the ledger the nib bent. This is what he does. Even when he loses, he finds a way to keep hurting people. Yes. What do we do? Nora pulled the appeal notice from her pocket. She'd gotten a copy from the clerk and read through the legal language for the 3rd time. Hale's lawyers were good. She'd give them that. They'd found 3 procedural grounds to contest, each one thin but technically arguable. We write to Henderson and Pritchard immediately, she said. They need to know. They need to make arrangements to survive until the money comes through. She folded the notice. And we go back to Judge Carver. The appeal doesn't dismiss the verdict. Hale is still guilty. He's still in custody. But his money is still out of reach. For now, she stood. It won't stay that way. Won't. What she didn't tell Caleb was how tired she was. She felt it bone deep, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, so much as from spending every waking moment in a state of controlled anxiety. She'd been here 3 months. In that time, she'd turned a stranger's crisis into a full territorial investigation, testified before a judge, and helped bring down a man who'd terrorized a valley for 15 years. And she still wasn't entirely sure where she fit in this life she'd agreed to. She and Caleb had never had a proper wedding. There'd been no time, no money to spare, and honestly no real conversation about whether they still wanted one. She'd come as his potential wife and become his partner in something much larger than marriage. And now that the emergency was over, the original question was still sitting between them, unanswered. She thought about it that night while Caleb slept and she lay awake listening to the wind. She was a practical woman. She thought in terms of facts and numbers. The facts were, she was living in his house, they'd become close in ways that had nothing to do with convenience, and neither of them had mentioned the original purpose of her arrival in weeks. The feeling was harder to quantify. He made her laugh sometimes, not often, but unexpectedly, in moments when she least expected it. He'd defended her in front of Hale's lawyers without being asked. He'd cried in the courtroom when the verdict was read and hadn't apologized for it. He was difficult in the ways that people who've been lonely too long are always difficult, closed off and slow to trust, needing to be given time. But he wasn't cruel, and he wasn't weak, and she respected him more than she'd respected any person she'd met in recent memory. That was the truth of it. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she got up, lit the lamp, and went back to work on the appeal response instead. The appeal hearing was scheduled for April, which gave them 6 weeks to prepare. In theory, Nora's job was done. She'd filed the original complaint, presented the evidence, and survived the trial. The appeal was a matter for the court and the Territorial Attorney General's office, which had taken over the prosecution after the case became public. In practice, nobody else understood the financial evidence the way she did. The Attorney General's man was a lawyer named Forsyth, who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday in early March with 2 assistants and the attitude of someone doing an enormous favor. He was competent, which was something, but he approached the accounting evidence like a man reading a foreign language. He understood the individual words, but kept losing the meaning. "Walk me through the interest miscalculation again," he said, for the 4th time. Nora smoothed the patience from her voice. Mr. Hale's statements showed a balance of $32,000 in the year 1878. The Mercers made payments totaling approximately $4,800 that year. If we apply the contracted interest rate of 8% annually to the balance, the ending balance should have been approximately $28,000. Right. But the January 1879 statement showed a balance of $33,000. So it went up. It went up by $1,000 even though they made nearly $5,000 in payments. She pointed to the column. The only way that's mathematically possible is if Hale charged approximately $6,000 in interest on a $32,000 principal, which would require an interest rate of over 18%. The contract specified 8. Forsyth stared at the numbers. So he lied on the statements. Yes. And he kept doing this for 15 years across at least 5 families with slight variations in approach to make each one look slightly different. She'd organized the comparison charts weeks ago, before anyone thought she'd need them for an appeal. But the underlying mathematics are identical. The interest charges consistently exceed the contracted rate. The payments are recorded but never properly applied to principal. The balances remain artificially inflated. And Hale's lawyers are arguing this is an accounting error. They're arguing it's a legitimate difference in interpretation of the contract terms. Nora sat back. Which is why we need to show the judge these comparison charts. 5 families, 5 contracts, all with the same pattern. An accounting error happens once, a pattern is intent. Forsyth looked at her with something like respect and something like irritation, the combination of a man who knows he's gotten lucky. You understand you'll need to testify again. I know. Hale's lawyers will be significantly more aggressive this time. They've had months to prepare. They'll attack your background, your qualifications, your relationship to the Mercers. I'm aware. They'll try to paint you as a bitter woman with a personal grudge. They'll suggest your analysis is motivated by... I said I'm aware. She met his eyes. Mr. Forsyth, I grew up doing accounts for men who thought women couldn't count. I've been underestimated my entire adult life. Victor Hale's lawyers are going to try to make me look stupid or emotional, and they're going to fail. Because unlike most things in this life, numbers don't care about your opinion of the person reading them. A small, reluctant smile crossed his face. No, I suppose they don't. March brought trouble from another direction. A man named Garrett showed up at the ranch on a Wednesday evening. He was pleasant-looking, mid-40s, with the groomed appearance of someone who worked in an office. He said he was from the Territorial Land Office. I have some concerns about the ownership documents for this property, he said, sitting across from Caleb at the kitchen table with a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nora stood in the doorway. She hadn't been invited to sit. What concerns? Caleb asked. The Mercer family's title to this land has been valid for 40 years, of course, but Mr. Hale's 40% stake, as established in the original partnership agreement, creates a complication. Garrett spread papers on the table. During the appeal process, the court has frozen restitution payments, but it hasn't ruled on Mr. Hale's ownership stake. Technically, he still owns 40% of this ranch. He was convicted of fraud, Nora said from the doorway. Garrett glanced at her, looked away, kept talking to Caleb. The conviction is being appealed. Until the appeal is resolved, his legal standing as a partial owner is intact. What does that mean? Caleb asked carefully. It means that if Mr. Hale's representatives were to request an inspection of the property, or if they were to challenge certain ranch operations, tell Hale's lawyers to file a motion. Nora stepped into the room. If they want to challenge ranch operations, they can do it in court, like adults. Garrett's pleasant expression developed a slight crack. Miss Whitmore, and it's Mrs. Mercer. She wasn't sure why she said it. Maybe because this man with his smooth manners and his sideways threats reminded her of every person who'd ever tried to intimidate her by ignoring she was in the room. Sit down or leave, Mr. Garrett. If you have legitimate business, we'll hear it. If you're here to deliver a message from Hale's people, we've already gotten it. Garrett stood. I was sent to discuss the matter informally. We don't do informal. We do documented and on the record. She opened the front door. Son, good evening. After he left, Caleb sat very still at the table. He'll be back. I know. She sat down across from him. They're looking for leverage, something they can use to delay the proceedings or force a settlement. Can they do something with the ownership stake? Technically, yes. If Hale's partial ownership isn't specifically voided by the verdict, and it wasn't, it was only the restitution order that came from the trial, he might still have some legal claim to be involved in ranch decisions. She pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. I need to ask Forsyth about this. There might be a way to get the ownership stake formally invalidated as part of the fraud conviction. And if there isn't, then we deal with it, one problem at a time. Caleb watched her write. You called yourself Mrs. Mercer. She didn't look up. It seemed more effective than trying to explain our arrangement to a man who was already not listening. Is that the only reason? She set down her pen, looked at him across the table. We should talk about that. The arrangement. Yes, we should. The lamp flickered. Outside, a horse shifted in the stable. The house settled around them with the comfortable creaks of an old building that had learned to live in the cold. I'm not the person you advertised for, she said. You wanted someone to help run the house. Cook, clean, keep things organized. Maybe a companion. Something manageable. I wanted someone who wouldn't break. That's what you wrote. But what you expected was probably simpler than this. Yes, he admitted. I expected someone who needed me as much as I needed them. Someone I'd be rescuing a little, and they'd be rescuing me, and we'd be equal in that way. And instead you got me. Instead I got you. His voice didn't make it sound like a complaint. Who turned out to need rescuing a lot less than I did? That's not true. I needed this. She looked around the kitchen. The worn table, the mismatched chairs, the window that stuck in the cold. I needed somewhere to be, somewhere that was mine too. She paused. I'm not easy to live with. I know that. I work too much and I forget to eat and I have a hard time sleeping and I ask too many questions about things that aren't my business. All of those things are also why we're sitting here instead of watching Hale take this ranch. I'm trying to tell you I'm not... She stopped, started again. I care about you more than I expected to. And I don't know what to do with that because I spent so long not depending on anyone that I'm not entirely sure how to let someone matter. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. My mother left when I was 9. Couldn't stand the isolation. He looked at his hands. My father never talked about it. Just worked harder, like he could fill the hole with labor. I grew up thinking that's what you do. You work and you endure and you don't ask for things you're not sure you'll get. That sounds lonely. It was. He met her eyes. It doesn't have to stay that way. The moment held itself between them, fragile and real. No, she said. It doesn't. They didn't talk about it further that night, but something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and the house felt different afterward, a little less like two strangers sharing space and a little more like something that could become a home. The appeal hearing in April lasted 2 days. Hale's lawyers were exactly as aggressive as Forsyth had warned. They challenged Nora's analysis, her credentials, her relationship to the case. One lawyer spent an entire hour suggesting that her role as Caleb's wife created a conflict of interest so profound that her testimony should be discarded entirely. Judge Carver let him finish. Then he looked over his spectacles and asked if the lawyer had any specific mathematical objection to the analysis or only a personal one. The lawyer said he was questioning the objectivity of the witness. The judge said objectivity was measured in methodology, not marital status, and asked again about the mathematics. There wasn't a good answer. Nora's testimony on the second day was the sharpest she'd ever given. She'd stayed up most of the night before, reviewing every calculation, checking every number one final time. By the time she sat down in the witness chair, she knew the evidence better than her own face. Hale's lawyers tried the technical confusion approach. They threw obscure accounting terminology at her, hoping she'd stumble or contradict herself. She didn't. She answered every question precisely, translated the complexity into plain language the judges could follow, and when one lawyer tried to suggest that compound interest calculations were inherently subjective, she laid out the mathematical proof on a chalkboard so clearly that even the lawyers went quiet. She looked once at Hale. He sat at the defendant's table with his hands folded, watching her the way a man watches a fire that's burning his house down. Not with anger anymore, just with the recognition of someone who understands they've already lost. The appeals judges deliberated for 3 days. On a Thursday morning in late April, the panel dismissed Hale's appeal. The original verdict was upheld. The restitution order was reinstated. And following Forsyth's motion, filed the week before at Nora's insistence, Victor Hale's ownership stake in the Mercer Ranch was formally voided as proceeds of a fraudulent enterprise. Nora heard the ruling standing in the courtroom hallway. She'd been too restless to sit inside. When the clerk came through the doors and told her, she nodded once, thanked him, and leaned against the wall for a long moment with her eyes closed. The relief was physical, almost dizzy. Months of tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders and neck and jaw all released at once, and for a moment she couldn't quite hold herself upright. Then Caleb was there. She didn't hear him come down the hallway. He was just suddenly beside her, and she turned and leaned into him without thinking about it, her forehead against his shoulder. He put his arms around her. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't an elegant moment. She was crying, which she hadn't expected, and her nose was running, and she was probably ruining his coat. He was still as a fence post, which was how he dealt with things he didn't know how to express. But his arms were solid, and his coat smelled like horses and cold air and wood smoke. "It's done," she said into his shoulder. "Yeah." His voice was rough. "It's done." They stood like that in the hallway until a lawyer walked by and pretended not to notice. And then Nora pulled back and looked for something to wipe her face with and ended up using her sleeve. "Classy," she muttered. Caleb produced a handkerchief from somewhere. It wasn't clean. She used it anyway. "Henderson and Pritchard," she said, pulling herself back together. "We need to send word immediately, and Forsyth needs to move on the restitution payments quickly before Hale's lawyers file another delay." Nora. I know. 5 minutes of celebrating, but we should... Nora. He took her face in both hands, just held it. 5 minutes. She stopped talking. Outside the courthouse, spring was doing something tentative with the world. The mountains had lost their deep winter snow and turned the pale green of new growth. The streets of Red Hollow were muddy with thaw, but alive with movement. Somewhere nearby, a child was yelling about something with the particular joy that comes from having no concept of how bad things can get. The restitution process began the following week. Hale's assets were systematically inventoried: land, cattle, accounts, business holdings. The seized properties were assessed. The mathematics of restoration began, slower and messier than any verdict, because justice is always faster in theory than in execution. Henderson got back 40 acres and a rebuilt barn, not the original barn, but solid and new. Pritchard received a payment that wouldn't fully replace what was lost, but gave him something to start again with. 3 other families, the ones who'd come forward after the newspaper story, received smaller settlements proportional to what Hale had taken. The Kowalskis, who were already in California, got a letter and a bank transfer that arrived 6 weeks after they'd started over in a place where nobody knew their name. Nora handled the paperwork for all of them. She spent 2 weeks at the courthouse, cross-referencing the asset inventory with the damages she'd calculated, making sure every family got what they were actually owed and not what a harried court clerk thought seemed approximate. Forsyth's office helped, though she frequently had to correct their math. One evening, she came home from the courthouse to find the house warm and food on the table, something Caleb had made himself, a stew that smelled much better than it looked. "You didn't have to," she said. "You haven't eaten since this morning. I watched you leave." She sat down and ate without arguing. It tasted better than it smelled, which surprised her enough to say so. "My father's recipe," Caleb said. "More or less. I don't actually know what he put in it. I've been improvising. It's good." "Don't sound so surprised." She smiled, and it caught her off guard. How easy the smile came. How little she'd been braced against the moment. She'd spent so long in a state of low-level vigilance that ordinary comfort felt unfamiliar, like a word she'd known as a child and half forgotten. "What happens now?" she asked. "Not about the case. About everything else. Caleb folded his hands around his own bowl. The ranch is ours. Clear title, no partners, no false debts. We've got horses to sell in spring, and I've been talking to the Lindqvist brothers about sharing a fence line. The north pasture needs work, but with decent weather, he stopped. Or were you asking something else? I was asking something else. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to pretend I'm easy to live with either. I go quiet when I should talk. I work until I'm stupid tired because I don't know how else to be. I've been alone long enough that I've got habits I'm not even aware of that probably drive you insane. Several, she confirmed. Yeah, he looked at the table. But I meant what I said before, about not wanting it to stay lonely. He looked up. If you still want this, whatever this is, the marriage and the ranch and the whole impractical mess of it, I'm still here, aren't I? You stayed because we were fighting hail. I stayed because I wanted to. She met his eyes across the table. The fighting just gave me an excuse to admit it. Something shifted in his face. Not a dramatic expression. Caleb didn't do dramatic expressions. Just a small settling, like a man who's been standing braced against a wind that's finally stopped. Then stay, he said. I intend to. The days that followed were the first ordinary days Nora had experienced since arriving in Red Hollow. No court proceedings, no evidence to organize, no threat waiting at the door. Just the ranch, the work, the slow business of building something real. It was harder in some ways than the fight. Fighting she understood. It had clear objectives, clear enemies, clear moments of victory or failure. Ordinary life had none of that structure. It was messy and repetitive and full of small frustrations and small satisfactions that didn't announce themselves. She burned breakfast twice. She argued with Caleb about the ranch accounts because she thought he was being too conservative in his estimates of the spring cattle revenue, and he thought she was being too optimistic, and they were both partly right. She found herself learning the horses by name and personality. She fixed a leak in the roof because Caleb was out on the range, and she didn't want to wait. She discovered that she liked the evenings best, when the work was done and the light went golden across the valley, and the world got quiet in a way that felt earned rather than empty. One evening, she wrote a letter to the Women's Bureau that had matched her with Caleb's advertisement. It wasn't a required letter. She wrote it anyway. The arrangement worked out, she wrote, better than expected. Though probably not in the way anyone anticipated. She didn't try to explain the rest of it. Some things were too complicated to fit in a letter, and too simple to need one. Victor Hale was transported to the territorial prison in the second week of May. Nora didn't go to watch. There was nothing she needed to see. He'd been a man who believed he could take anything he wanted as long as he was smart enough to dress the theft in legal language, and he'd spent 15 years being right about that. Until he wasn't. She heard about it secondhand from Caleb, who'd heard it from the station master. Apparently he didn't say anything when they loaded him onto the prison wagon, Caleb said. Just looked back at the valley like he was trying to memorize it. Good. She was mending a bridle and didn't look up. Let him. She wasn't generous enough to feel sorry for him, and she was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. He'd destroyed families. He'd stolen years of people's lives. He'd counted on fear and silence and the human tendency to trust a number on a page, and he'd weaponized all of it without remorse. The only thing she felt when she heard his name was the particular satisfaction of knowing he was gone. It rained the next morning, a slow spring rain that smelled like wet earth and pine. Nora stood on the porch drinking coffee and watching it come down across the pastures, greening everything it touched. The ranch looked different than it had the day she arrived. Not physically. The buildings were the same, the fences in the same places, the mountains the same ragged edge against the sky. But she saw it differently now. Not as a stranger's desperation she'd agreed to share, as something she'd helped save, something that had her fingerprints on it. Caleb appeared beside her with his own cup. They stood shoulder to shoulder watching the rain. The north fence is holding better, he said. I know, I checked it yesterday. I know you checked it. I could see where you walked. The rain came harder for a moment, drumming on the porch roof. Then it eased back. I want to learn more about the cattle side, she said. The finances I understand, but the actual operation, breeding cycles, market timing, when to sell and when to hold, I don't know enough. I can teach you. I know you can. I'm saying I want to learn. He looked at her sideways. You're saying you want to be involved. I'm saying this is my ranch too, our ranch. She hadn't quite said it that plainly before. I'm done being a guest in my own house. He was quiet for a moment. You were never a guest. It felt like it sometimes, like I was waiting for permission to really be here. You never needed permission. I know that now. She drank the last of her coffee. Show me the breeding records this afternoon? Yeah. There was something in his voice, quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Yeah, I can do that. The rain stopped by mid-morning. The mountains emerged clean and vivid against a sky that had scrubbed itself pale blue. Down in the valley, somewhere out of sight, a creek was running full and fast with runoff. Nora went back inside and picked up a ledger. Not the old ones. Not Hale's manipulated statements or the years of falsified balances. A new one, clean pages, her own handwriting across the top. Mercer Ranch. Accounts. Spring, 1882. She opened to the first page and started writing. The new ledger filled faster than Nora expected. By June, the Mercer Ranch had more activity than it had seen in years. Two of the neighboring families, the Lindqvists and a younger couple named Brower, who'd settled the adjacent parcel the previous fall, started coming by regularly to share equipment and trade labor during the busy weeks. It was practical, the kind of arrangement that frontier people had always made out of necessity. But it felt like something more, like the valley was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Caleb handled it better than Nora expected. He was not, by nature, a social man. He'd spent years in a kind of enforced isolation, part circumstance, part pride, part the particular loneliness of a man who's watching everything he inherited slowly disappear and doesn't know how to ask for help. But the fight against Hale had changed something in him, or maybe just revealed something that had always been there, buried under the weight of survival. He still went quiet at meals when he was tired. He still woke before dawn and went out to the barn alone, the way men do when they need to think without anyone watching. But he'd started leaving the front door unlatched during the day instead of bolted, which Nora understood was its own kind of statement. The first real test of the new ledger came in late June, when Caleb came back from town with a look on his face that she'd learned to read by now. Not the dark, shuttered expression of the early months. This was something different, tighter around the eyes, like he was carrying news he wasn't sure how to deliver. Sit down, she said, without looking up from the column she was adding. I'm fine standing. Caleb, he sat. Ran into Ed Lindqvist in town. He heard something at the feed store. He took his hat off, turned it in his hands. Hale's lawyers filed a new motion, not for the appeal. That's done. This is something else. They're arguing that the court's order voiding Hale's ownership stake was jurisdictionally improper, that it should have been a separate civil proceeding, not attached to the criminal verdict. Nora set down her pen. Is that a real argument? Forsyth apparently thinks it might be. Ed saw him coming out of Judge Carver's office looking worried. She was quiet for a moment, running the implications forward in her mind the way she ran columns, methodically, following each number to where it led. If they can separate the ownership question from the criminal conviction, they could potentially reopen the ownership stake while Hale is still in prison, which means he'd still technically own 40% of this ranch. Yes, from a prison cell. His lawyers would act on his behalf. She picked up her pen again, then set it down again. It's a nuisance strategy. They know they can't get him out. They know they can't reverse the verdict. So they're trying to create enough legal noise that we eventually give up or run out of money to fight. Can they win it? The jurisdiction argument? She thought about it honestly. Maybe. Jurisdictional challenges are tricky. It depends on how the judge interprets the original order. She looked at him. I need to see the motion. Can you get a copy from the courthouse? Already asked. Clerk said he'd send one out tomorrow. Good. She reopened the ledger, but her mind was elsewhere now, moving through the problem the way it always did when something legal and numerical intersected. We'll need Forsyth to respond, and I want to look at the original ownership voiding order carefully. There may be language in there that anticipates this kind of challenge. You think you drafted it to account for this? I think I drafted everything to account for everything. That was the only way I knew how to do it. She paused. But I'm not a lawyer. So maybe not. The motion arrived the next day. Nora read it twice, then read it a third time with the original ownership voiding order beside it. Caleb sat across from her at the desk, pretending to work on something else, watching her face. Well, he asked finally. It's not nothing. The argument has some technical merit. She tapped the page. But they made a mistake. Here, they cite a precedent from the Dakota Territory, arguing that ownership disputes require separate civil proceedings. But that precedent was about disputed ownership between two living parties. Hale's ownership stake wasn't disputed. It was derived from a fraudulent contract. That's a different legal category. Is that enough to win? It's enough to argue. Whether it's enough to win depends on the judge. She pulled out a sheet of paper. I'm going to draft a response for Forsyth. He can refine it, put it in proper legal language. But the core argument is sound. When? Tonight. He looked at her the way he sometimes did, with that complicated expression she'd never fully learned to read, somewhere between admiration and worry and something else she didn't have a word for yet. You don't have to do this alone, you know. Forsyth has a whole office. Forsyth's office took 3 weeks to catch a calculation error that was going to undercount Henderson's restitution by $400. I don't have that kind of time or that kind of money. She pulled the lamp closer. I trust my own work. I know you do. He stood. I'll make coffee. She worked until past midnight. The response she drafted was 12 pages, concise by legal standards, devastating in its precision. It dismantled Hale's jurisdictional argument point by point, cited counter-precedents from 3 territories, and concluded with a calculation showing that allowing the challenge to succeed would effectively render all fraud-related ownership voidings legally vulnerable, which would open a door that no territorial judge would want opened. She sent it to Forsyth the next morning with a note that said, "Use what's useful, fix what's wrong, get it filed this week." He sent back a reply 2 days later. "Used everything, filed yesterday. You should have gone to law school." She almost laughed. Then she thought about what law school would have actually required of a woman in 1870 and decided she was better off where she was. The jurisdictional challenge was dismissed in July. Judge Carver's ruling was 3 sentences, which was about as close as a territorial judge got to openly annoyed. The ownership voiding stood. Hale's lawyers went quiet for 6 weeks after that, which Nora found more unnerving than their activity. Quiet men with good lawyers were always planning something. But summer pushed forward regardless, indifferent to legal battles and old grievances. The cattle did well. The north pasture, after the fence repairs and some reseeding Caleb had managed in May, came back greener than it had been in years. The Browers brought over a load of timber they'd cut and couldn't use, and Caleb traded them 2 days of fence-building labor in exchange. Nobody called it charity. It wasn't. Nora learned the breeding records the way she'd learned accounting, by sitting with them until the patterns became visible. She made mistakes. She misread a notation in Caleb's shorthand and got the breeding cycles wrong for a month. And when she figured out the error, she was furious with herself in the contained, focused way she was furious about most things. She fixed it, adjusted the records, made a note of the shorthand convention she'd misunderstood. "You're hard on yourself," Caleb said one evening. He'd watched her stare at the corrected records for a full minute before closing the book. "I made a mistake." "You fixed it. Nothing was lost." This time, mistakes in accounting compound. She put the book on the shelf. "I know better than to misread a notation." "You also learned a system you've never seen before in about 3 weeks, which is pretty fast." He was sharpening a knife at the table, slow, deliberate strokes against the whetstone. "My father spent 10 years with those records, and he still got things wrong. Your father had other things on his mind. So do you." She turned around. "What does that mean?" He looked up from the knife. "It means you've been running on 4 or 5 hours of sleep since February. It means you spend more time thinking about everyone else's problems than your own. The Kowalskis in California, Henderson's rebuilt barn, what Forsyth might or might not file incorrectly." He set down the knife. "At some point, you have to let people handle their own lives. I'm not trying to run anyone's life. No. You're trying to prevent anything from going wrong for anyone, which is a different problem, but still a problem." She sat down at the table. I know I do it." She rubbed her eyes. "I grew up in a house where if you didn't watch everything closely, something would fall apart. My mother was sick for years. My father—" She stopped. "My father meant well, but he was not reliable. So I watched, I tracked, I kept things in order because if I didn't, no one else would." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How old were you?" "When I started? About 11? He set down the whetstone. Nora. I'm not saying it to make you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it because it explains the habit. I know the habit is excessive. I'm working on it. She looked at him. When I catch myself doing it, I try to stop. And when you don't catch yourself, that's what I need you for. The corner of his mouth turned up. I'm useful then. Don't push your luck. He picked the knife back up. She sat with him while he finished sharpening it, not working, just sitting, which was its own kind of practice. The problem with Hale's people didn't come from the lawyers. It came from a man named Rourke. He showed up in Red Hollow in August, a big, quiet man who took a room at the boarding house and spent his first 3 days doing nothing that anyone could object to. He drank at the saloon without causing trouble. He ate at the restaurant without speaking to anyone. He walked the streets of town like he was surveying it. Nora heard about him from Miss Graves, the schoolteacher who'd helped them print the newspaper that winter. She was careful enough with information that Nora had come to trust her instincts. Something's off about him, Miss Graves said. They were standing outside the general store on a Tuesday morning. He asked about the Mercer Ranch by name, wanted to know how far out it was, how many people lived there, whether the road was passable year-round. Did he say why? Said he was considering land investment in the area. Miss Graves kept her voice neutral. He had the right words, but land investors don't usually ask about specific ranches by name before they've spoken to the land office. No, they don't. Nora kept her expression even. What does he look like? Miss Graves described him. Nora didn't recognize the name or the description, but that meant nothing. Hale had been in prison for 3 months. 3 months was enough time to make arrangements. She told Caleb that evening. He was quieter than she expected, which meant he'd already been thinking about it. I heard about him too, he said, from Lindqvist's hired man, who drinks with the men at the boarding house. Said Rourke's been asking about the court case, specifically about you. About me. About where you came from, what you know, whether you're planning to stay. Caleb was staring at the lamp. Lindqvist's man said he was asking careful, like he was trying not to be noticed asking, but he wasn't quite careful enough. Nora thought about this, about what Hale's people would want from that information, whether she had other cases she could file, other investigations she might start, whether she was planning to leave, and if she left, whether the Mercer Ranch would have anyone left who understood the legal situation well enough to defend it. He's gathering information, she said, not planning anything physical. If Hale wanted to threaten us, he'd send someone harder looking. Maybe, or maybe Rourke's the first step. Either way, we don't run. She looked at Caleb. And we don't pretend we haven't noticed. That's what they're counting on, that we'll see the shadow and get scared before they actually do anything. What do we do instead? I'm going to have a conversation with Marshal Cross. Samuel Cross had been in Red Hollow twice since the trial concluded. Once to oversee the prisoner transport to the territorial prison. Once for routine business that had nothing to do with the Mercer case. Both times he'd stopped at the ranch. He was a careful man and an honest one, which was rare enough in his position to be remarkable. She rode to town the next morning and found him at the jailhouse, doing paperwork with the resigned expression of a man who'd been doing paperwork since before it was properly light. Mrs. Mercer, he said, there's a man named Rourke staying at the boarding house. He's been asking about me and about the ranch. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited. I have no specific evidence he's connected to Hale, but the timing and the questions are consistent with someone doing reconnaissance on Hale's behalf. Cross set down his pen. What do you want me to do about it? Nothing illegal. I'm not asking you to run him out of town or arrest him for curiosity. She leaned forward. I'm asking you to be aware of him and to make sure he's aware that you're aware of him. Sometimes that's enough. And if it's not? Then we'll know because something will happen and you'll be already watching. Cross was quiet for a moment. You know, most people who come into this office to report potential trouble want me to make it go away immediately, loudly if possible. I'm not most people. No, you're really not. He picked up his pen again. I'll keep an eye on Rourke. I'll also ask around at the boarding house. Quietly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If he's connected to Hale, there's not much I can legally do until he does something I can charge him with. I know, I'm not expecting miracles, just alertness. Rourke left town 4 days later, just packed up and went, without any incident that anyone could name. Either Cross's attention had made him uncomfortable, or he'd gathered what he came for, or both. Nora watched the road out of town from the ranch porch until she couldn't see the dust of his horse anymore. Then she went back inside and made a note in the margin of the new ledger, not an accounting note. Just a date and a name in case she ever needed to remember. August gave way to September. The valley turned the color of old gold, which Nora found beautiful in a way that surprised her. She hadn't expected to find anything about this landscape beautiful. She'd expected practical, useful, survivable. Instead, she kept getting caught off guard by the light on the mountains in the evening, or the way the creek sounded in October when it started to run low, or the smell of the first frost, which was nothing like any smell she'd known in Pennsylvania. It was cleaner somehow, colder and cleaner, and strangely comforting. She was standing at the kitchen window on a Thursday in mid-September when she heard the sound of wagons on the road. More than one. She leaned closer to the glass and saw 3 wagons coming up the lane, which wasn't usual. Caleb came in from the barn. "You see them?" "Who are they?" "Henderson. He sent a letter last week. I meant to tell you. Sorry. He's relocating, moving his family back to the territory." Caleb was already pulling his coat on. "And that second wagon is Brower's. Lars said he'd help with the unloading." Nora looked at the wagons, then at Caleb. "Henderson's coming back. Couldn't make a go of it in Denver. Said he kept feeling like a city man even though he'd spent 30 years on land." Caleb half smiled. "Asked if I knew of any available parcels nearby." And I told him about the old Whitfield property 2 miles east. Hale never got his hands on it because old man Whitfield died with no debts and a suspicious enough family to read every piece of paper twice before signing. He glanced at her. "It's a good piece of land. Needs work." Henderson's got the experience. She looked at the wagons again, at the figures climbing down. A man she recognized, a woman she'd only seen once in the courthouse hallway, 3 children who jumped to the ground and immediately scattered like birds. "You planned this," she said. "I suggested a possibility. Henderson made his own decision." "You suggested it because this valley's been emptying out for 15 years while Hale bled it dry. Because families that should have stayed got forced out. And because having good neighbors means more to a ranch's survival than any court ruling." He buttoned his coat. "And maybe because I thought you'd like it, having people nearby that you actually know." She looked at him. This man who went quiet at meals and woke before dawn and kept things inside until he found the right moment to let them out. Who'd cried silently in a courtroom when a verdict was read and hadn't apologized for it. Who'd told her she didn't need permission to be home when that was exactly what she'd needed to hear. "I do like it," she said. They went outside to meet the wagons. Henderson was thinner than she remembered from the trial, weathered in a way that meant hard months, not just hard weather. But his handshake was firm and his eyes were clear. And when he looked at the land around him, his expression was the look of someone who'd been trying to breathe thin air and finally found altitude they recognized. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "good to have you back." His wife, Clara, was a practical, round-faced woman who took in the Mercer property with the assessing gaze of someone who knew what it took to make a place work. She shook Nora's hand with both of hers and said, "I've been wanting to thank you properly. The letter you sent, when you explained the restitution would be delayed, you didn't have to do that. Most people in your position would have just waited for the official notice." "I knew you'd need time to make arrangements," Nora said. "The official notice wouldn't have given you that." "It didn't, but your letter did." Clara held on to her hand a moment longer. "Thank you." The children, 2 boys and a girl who appeared to be conducting a private investigation of the barn at a speed their parents hadn't approved, made Nora realize how quiet the ranch had been, how absent that particular kind of noise was from a place that had been running on survival rather than life. They spent the afternoon helping the Hendersons unload and organize what they'd brought, which wasn't much because starting over twice in 3 years doesn't leave you with much. The Browers came and helped too. Lars Brower's wife, Marta, brought food, a pot of something that smelled the way autumn should, and a round of hard cheese they'd made themselves. By evening, there were 8 adults and 3 children sitting around the Mercer dining table, which had never in Nora's time here been used for anything but accounting work. And the conversation was the overlapping, contradictory, interrupted kind that happens when people have too much to say and not enough time to say it all carefully. Henderson's oldest boy, 12, with his father's direct gaze, asked Caleb about the horses with the focused intensity of someone who'd decided this was the most important subject available. Caleb answered him seriously, without talking down, the way he did with most things. Nora watched it from across the table and felt something catch in her chest that she didn't try to name right away. Later, after the Hendersons had gone to take temporary accommodation at the Brower's place and the dishes were cleared, Caleb sat down in his chair by the fire and looked like he'd been awake for 3 days. "Good tired or bad tired?" she asked. "Good." He stretched his legs toward the fire. "Real good." She sat in the other chair. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the night was getting cold in the way that meant real autumn was arriving, not the transitional warmth of early September. She could hear the horses shifting in the barn. "I need to tell you something," she said. He opened his eyes. "That sounds serious." "It's not serious, it's just—" She stopped, started again. "I wrote to the Women's Bureau in July. After the appeal was dismissed, I said the arrangement had worked out. Good. The thing is, the arrangement isn't exactly what I came for, or what you asked for." She looked at the fire. "You asked for someone who wouldn't break. I came because I needed somewhere to be, and what actually happened was different from either of those things." "Nora, let me finish." She took a breath. "What actually happened is that I found something I didn't know I was looking for, and I want to make sure that I want you to know that I'm not here because of the arrangement anymore. I'm not here because of necessity or contract or having nowhere else to go. I'm here because I want to be here, because this is the first place that ever felt like it was actually mine." She finally looked at him. "I wanted to say that out loud, so we both know." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. A horse called softly from the barn. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "What?" "I think you've been worried for months that you're here under false pretenses, that you came for one reason and stayed for another, and somewhere in there you feel like you owe me an explanation." She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "You don't," he said. "People come to things sideways all the time. That doesn't make the thing less real." He looked at her. "This is your home, Nora. Has been since about the 3rd night you spent working through my father's files by candlelight. I just didn't know how to say so without it sounding like I was telling you what to feel." She had to look at the fire for a moment. "We're both terrible at this." "Yeah, but we're getting better." The October rains came the following week, heavy and relentless, turning the roads to mud and the creek to a rushing brown torrent. The cattle had to be moved to higher ground. A section of the east fence went down under the weight of a fallen tree, and Caleb and Lars Brower spent 2 cold days in the rain repairing it, while Nora and Marta Brower cataloged the winter supplies and figured out what needed to be ordered before the road got worse. She was good at the work, not the way she was good at numbers. Numbers were almost effortless, just clear thinking applied to clear problems. Ranch work was different. It was physical and unpredictable and frequently required improvising solutions with whatever was at hand. She was still learning, still making errors, still occasionally doing things the hard way when there was an easier way she hadn't discovered yet. But she was getting better. Henderson came by in the 3rd week of October, when the rains had let up enough to make the road passable again. He and Caleb had been corresponding about the Whitfield property, and he'd made a formal offer to the Whitfield heirs, who were living in St. Louis and would probably have let the land sit idle for another decade if someone hadn't made them a fair offer. "They accepted," Henderson said, standing in the doorway with the look of a man still not quite believing his own news. "Closing is next month, assuming the title search comes back clean." "It will," Nora said. She'd checked the Whitfield title herself. Old habit, couldn't help it, when Caleb first mentioned the property. "No encumbrances, no liens, heirs clearly documented. It's a clean title." Henderson looked at her. "Did you already checked?" "Just in case." He shook his head slowly. "You know what the hardest part of losing the old place was? It wasn't the land. It was feeling like I'd missed something I should have seen, like I wasn't smart enough to protect my own family." He looked from her to Caleb. "Watching what you did, both of you, helped me stop feeling stupid. Does that make sense?" "You weren't stupid," Nora said. "Hale was sophisticated and patient, and he'd been perfecting his method for years before he got to you. The only reason I could see it was because I came in cold, without any of the trust you'd built up over years of business with him." "Trust,"
Henderson said it like a word he was still reassessing. Trust is how communities function, she said. Hale exploited that. That's on him, not on the people who trusted him.
Henderson nodded slowly. Clara wants to invite you both for dinner when we're settled in the new place. We'd like that, Caleb said. After Henderson left, Nora stood in the doorway watching him ride back down the muddy road. The sky was the thick gray of late October, pressing down on the mountains, promising more rain or possibly the first real snow. We should winterize the south barn, she said. I know. And order additional feed before the road gets really bad. Already did. Last Tuesday. She turned to look at him. When did you stop waiting for me to think of things first? About 3 months ago. He was smiling, the real kind, not the cautious half-smile she'd first learned to read. You were busy. I figured I'd manage. I didn't notice. I know. That's how I knew you were busy. She thought about that, about how much had shifted between them so gradually she hadn't marked it happening. The way he'd started leaving notes about things he'd ordered or decisions he'd made so she could update the ledger. The way she'd started checking the stable temperature before she checked the books in the morning because she'd learned that the horses needed attention before the numbers did. Small calibrations. The kind that don't happen when people are trying to impress each other, only when they're just trying to live. The first snow came in November, earlier than expected, dumping 8 inches in one night and turning the valley white and silent. Nora stood at the kitchen window before dawn with coffee she'd made herself. She was getting better at coffee, and watched the snow catch the first gray light. She thought about the letter she'd written the Women's Bureau, about the word arrangement, about how inadequate it was for everything that had actually happened here, in this house, in this valley, over the course of a year that had been the hardest and the most clarifying of her life. She heard Caleb come downstairs. He stopped beside her at the window. Big one, he said. Yes. Cattle should be fine. I moved them yesterday before dark. I know. I saw you from the window. They stood looking at the snow. The mountains had disappeared behind white sky. The world had contracted to the ranch and the tree line and the creek, which was still running, dark water through white banks. We should get married properly, Nora said. If you still want to. He took a moment. Still want to? I've been waiting for you to stop being too busy to discuss it. I wasn't too busy. You were always in the middle of something. I'm always in the middle of something. That's not going to change. She turned to look at him. I'm saying we should do it anyway. In spite of everything else. When? Spring, maybe. When the Hendersons are settled and the worst of the legal business is behind us. She paused. Something small. I'm not interested in a production. Small suits me fine. With Forsyth absolutely not invited. Caleb actually laughed at that. A real laugh. The kind that went all the way up. He'll be offended. He'll recover. She turned back to the window. Miss Graves should be there, though, and the Lindqvists, and Henderson and Clara. That's not that small. Small by comparison to everything this year has been. He put his hand on the window frame beside hers, close enough that their fingers were almost touching. Almost. Yeah, he said. Compared to this year, it's nothing. The snow kept falling. The coffee went cold. They stood at the window until the light came up properly, and the ranch emerged from the dark in all its imperfect, necessary realness. The south barn with its patched roof, the fence line that still needed 2 more posts replaced before real winter set in, the horses moving in the corral with the slow, purposeful grace of animals that know they're cared for. Nora had spent most of her life in places where she was needed but not wanted, where she was useful but not permanent, where the understanding, unspoken but clear, was that she could be replaced, returned, let go. She looked at the land and thought, this is mine. Not in the legal sense, though that was true now too. In the other sense, the one that has nothing to do with documents or contracts or any number in any ledger. The one that just means, I fought for this. I stayed. I built something here that wasn't here before. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Winter settled over Red Hollow like a decision. Not the tentative, apologetic kind of winter that keeps second-guessing itself with mild days and partial thaws. This one came in hard and stayed. Temperatures that turned the creek to black ice by December, snowdrifts that buried the lower fence lines by January, weeks where the sky and the ground were the same flat white and the only color in the world was the dark line of pine trees on the ridge. The valley went quiet in that particular way that only happens when everything that can leave has left, and everything that's staying has made its peace with staying. Nora found she didn't mind it. She'd expected to. She'd grown up in cities where winter was something you endured between buildings, managed with coal heat and layered wool, minimized as much as possible. Out here, there was no minimizing it. You prepared, you waited, you worked around it, and when a storm came in, you simply stopped fighting and let it pass. It was the most honest relationship with weather she'd ever had, and there was something clarifying about that. The ranch ran quietly through December. Caleb handled the cattle and horses with the methodical attention of a man who'd learned to read animals the way some people read faces. Nora kept the books, managed the winter supply inventory, and wrote letters. To Henderson about the Whitfield closing, which had gone through without complications. To Forsyth about a final accounting question regarding the restitution payments. To the Kowalskis in California, whose address she'd gotten through the territorial court records, and whom she'd been corresponding with sporadically since October. The Kowalski letters were the ones she spent the most time on. She'd never met them. They'd left before the investigation became public, before any of the testimony was gathered, before there was any reason to believe that fighting back was even possible. They'd simply packed what they could carry and gone, because staying had stopped being survivable. Their letters back were short and careful, written in the formal English of people who'd learned it as a second language and were still not entirely sure they trusted it. The gist of what they said was, "We are making do. The land here is different. We miss home, but home is gone." The restitution payment had reached them in November. Not the full amount Hale had stolen, because by the time the asset liquidation was complete, the mathematics of recovery didn't fully match the mathematics of theft. It never did. But it was enough that the letters became slightly less careful, the way letters do when the writer no longer has to choose every word, with the consideration of someone who has nothing to spare. Nora wrote back in January. She told them about the valley, about Henderson coming home and Brower's fence line and the way the mountains looked in the first snow. She wasn't sure why she wrote it. She just thought they should know what Red Hollow was becoming, even if they couldn't come back to it. She sealed the letter and put it with the others going out when the road cleared. The road cleared in the second week of February, which was also when the last significant legal business arrived from Forsyth's office. It came in an envelope stamped with the Territorial Attorney General's seal, which meant Caleb carried it in from the mailbox, with the careful neutrality of a man who's learned not to react to things until he knows what he's reacting to. "Forsyth," Nora said, taking it from him. "I know. Open it." She opened it, read it once, read it again. "The final restitution audit is complete," she said. "All payments to all families have been confirmed received and properly allocated." She looked up. "And Hale's remaining assets, the ones that were still tied up in legal dispute, have been liquidated. The proceeds cover the final balance owed to 3 families who were shorted in the initial distribution." Caleb let out a long breath. "It's done. It's done." She set the letter on the desk carefully. The legal apparatus that had consumed most of the past 14 months. The original complaint, the trial, the appeal, the jurisdictional challenge, the restitution audit, the motions and counter-motions and correspondence with territorial officials, all of it, finally, resolved. Filed away. Finished. She'd expected to feel more, or maybe differently. Some kind of formal internal closing, like a door settling into its frame. What she actually felt was quieter than that. Not emptiness, but the specific stillness that follows sustained noise. The moment after a storm when the air doesn't know what to do with itself yet. "How much did we spend on legal costs?" Caleb asked. "Total? Between Forsyth's office, my travel to the courthouse, the telegraph costs, and everything else?" She opened the ledger to the page she'd been tracking. $412. He winced. "That's less than 1 month of the fraudulent payments your father was making to Hale." She closed the ledger. "And we own the ranch free and clear. No partners, no contested title, no outstanding claims." She paused. "I'd call that a reasonable exchange." He was quiet for a moment. "My father spent his whole life in debt that wasn't real. Died thinking he'd left me nothing worth keeping." He looked at the ledger. "I want to put a stone for him at the north fence line, where he used to walk in the mornings. Not a grave marker. His grave is in town. Just something so the land remembers he was here. Nora set down her pen. We can do that. I know it's not practical. I didn't say it wasn't practical. I said we can do it. He looked at her with that particular expression, the one she'd stopped trying to translate because some things didn't need translation. Saturday, when the ground's not frozen hard? Saturday. They found a flat stone near the creek that had been there long enough to belong to the land. Caleb hauled it to the north fence line on a cold, clear February Saturday while Nora watched and did not offer to help, because she'd learned to read the difference between things he wanted help with and things he needed to do himself. He set the stone at the base of the fence post where his father's morning walks had always ended. She knew this because he'd told her once, offhandedly, in the way people mention important things when they're trying to make them sound small. He stood there for a while after he'd set the stone right. Nora stayed back far enough to give him the silence, and close enough that he'd know she was there. When he came back, his face was the face of someone who has put something down after carrying it too long. Not healed. That was the wrong word. Too clean. More like recalibrated. Like a man who's decided to stop blaming himself for the weight of what someone else did. You're cold, he said when he reached her. I'm fine. You've been out here 20 minutes in the same coat you wear in the house. I said I'm fine. She started walking back. But coffee would be good. Yeah, he said, falling into step beside her. Yeah, it would. Spring came in slow and argumentative, the way it does in mountain country. 3 warm days followed by a late freeze, mud that made the roads impassable for a week. Then a morning that smelled so sharply of new growth that Nora stopped on the porch with her coffee and couldn't immediately remember what she'd been about to do. The wedding was in April. Nora had been right that it would be small. She'd also been wrong about what small meant when it's the first real gathering a community has had for reasons that aren't fear or crisis or mutual defense. What she'd said to Caleb was 8 or 10 people. Simple, nothing elaborate. What actually happened was 23 people in the yard of the Mercer Ranch on a Saturday afternoon in April, because the Hendersons told the Browers and the Browers mentioned it to the Lindqvists, and somewhere in the chain of telling, the Oleander family from the far end of the valley heard and showed up with a fiddle and a dried fruitcake that nobody had requested but everyone appreciated. Miss Graves stood beside Nora during the ceremony. Not as a formal bridesmaid, there was nothing that formal about any of it, but because she'd been one of the first people in Red Hollow to help without being asked, and Nora didn't forget things like that. Judge Carver performed the ceremony, which was either a coincidence or evidence that he'd arranged to be in Red Hollow on that specific Saturday, though he denied the latter with the precise non-denial of a man who is technically not lying. The ceremony itself was short. Caleb had written his part of it out on paper and then lost the paper and had to say it from memory, which meant it was rougher and more honest than anything he'd written down. He said he'd spent most of his adult life not trusting anything, and that trusting her was the one thing in recent years he'd done that had turned out to be not just right, but necessary. He said he wasn't promising ease because they both knew better. He was promising that he'd keep showing up. Nora hadn't prepared anything. She'd tried to write something twice and both times deleted it. The first draft sounded too formal, like a legal document, and the second sounded like she was trying too hard to be poetic, which she found more embarrassing than silence. So she just said, I came here because I had nothing left to lose. And now I have everything to keep. I'm going to spend a long time figuring out how to deserve that. But I'm going to spend it here. Someone, she thought it might have been Clara Henderson, made a sound that was either a laugh or a sob or both. The fiddle started before the judge had quite finished speaking, which meant the gathering became a celebration slightly ahead of schedule, and nobody seemed to mind. There was food. There was more of the whiskey from the general store. Henderson told a story about his first winter on the new Whitfield place that involved a lost calf, a frozen creek, and a level of improvisation that strained credulity but was apparently true. Lars Brower fell asleep in a chair by 8 o'clock, and nobody woke him. 3 of the Henderson children organized a game in the South Pasture that had unclear rules and enormous enthusiasm. Nora stood at the edge of the gathering at one point and just watched it, the light going amber over the mountains. The noise of people who'd chosen to be there. The ranch that 6 months ago had been a contested legal battleground and was now just a place where people were eating dried fruitcake and arguing about fence posts. She thought about the night she'd arrived. The frozen platform, the silent wagon ride. The cold house with the ledgers full of 15 years of lies. She thought about the first time she'd put her finger on a fraudulent entry and known, not suspected, known, that something was deeply wrong. She thought about the courthouse clerk who'd gone pale at the mention of Hale's name, and Judge Carver reading the complaint with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this, and Pritchard testifying with his hand shaking and his voice steady. She thought about all the people who'd made quiet choices along the way. Miss Graves with her printing press, Marshall Cross making himself visible near the right places, Henderson and Pritchard traveling to testify when they could have stayed home and protected themselves, the Lindqvists showing up to help with the fence without being asked. All these small individual decisions that didn't feel heroic in the moment, that probably just felt like the thing to do, the next right thing, but that added up, collectively, to something that actually changed what was possible. That was the thing that still surprised her. Not that Hale had been stopped. The evidence was strong enough that eventually the math would have caught up with him one way or another, probably, but that so many people, given the chance to help and the assurance that someone was willing to go first, had chosen to help. She'd expected less of people. Experience had taught her to expect less. Maybe that was the real thing she'd been wrong about, coming into Red Hollow with her worn trunk and her sharp mind and her assumption that she'd have to fight alone. Caleb appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of something warm. "You're thinking loudly again." "I'm always thinking." "I know, your face does this thing." He handed her a cup. "What thing?" "Concentrating thing, like you're running calculations." She accepted the cup. "I was thinking about the first night, when I got here." "What about it?" "I was so certain I was on my own, that I'd have to carry all of it myself." She looked at the gathering in the yard. "I was wrong about that." "You weren't entirely wrong. You did most of the heavy lifting." "The math, yes, but—" She stopped, trying to find the right words for something she didn't usually try to articulate. "The math only works if someone's willing to use it, and I would have been willing, and I probably would have filed the complaint, and it might have gone nowhere because I was a stranger with no history here, and no reason for anyone to trust me. What made it work was that people kept choosing to get involved, to take the risk. Starting with you. Starting with me. But you could have thrown me out that first night, told me it was none of my business, and to keep my opinions about the ledgers to myself." "I thought about it." She looked at him. "Did you really?" "For about 30 seconds. He was looking at the mountains. Then I thought about my father's letter, the one he wrote asking Patterson for help, and I thought, here's a woman who's already asking the right questions, and if I send her away, I deserve whatever happens next. So you kept me out of practicality. Mostly, and maybe because you were the first person to walk into this house in years and not look sorry for me." He glanced at her. "You just looked annoyed that the books were wrong." "They were very wrong." "Yeah." He was almost smiling. "They really were." The gathering wound down slowly, the way good ones do. People leaving in ones and twos, collecting children and leftover food, extending handshakes into conversations that extended further into the evening, until finally it was just the Hendersons saying their last goodbyes, and Clara hugging Nora briefly in the way of women who recognize something in each other that doesn't need to be named. "Come by next week," Clara said. "I want to show you what we've done with the East Room." "I will." Henderson shook Caleb's hand, then Nora's, then paused. "I've been trying to think how to say this properly," he said, "but I'm not sure there's a proper way, so I'll just say it plain." He looked at Nora. "When I was at my lowest point, after we lost the property, after my daughter was sick, after we'd gone to Denver and found out that leaving doesn't fix you, I was angry for a long time at everything, at Hale, at the court, at myself, and then I got your letter, the one explaining the restitution delay." He paused. "You didn't have to write that. You had your own fight to handle, but you wrote it. And something about knowing that someone was still paying attention, still keeping track, still treating us like we mattered." He stopped. "It helped more than the money did, if I'm being honest." Nora didn't have an easy response to that. She was bad at receiving things, had always been better at giving them. "You deserved someone to pay attention," she said finally. "You all did. That was the whole problem. Hale was counting on everyone feeling too small and isolated to push back. Once people started knowing they weren't alone in it, everything changed." Henderson nodded slowly. "Still, thank you." After they were gone, Nora and Caleb cleaned up in companionable silence. Stacked plates, Folded blankets that had been spread on hay bales for seating chased the remnants of the dried fruitcake from the table where the oleanders had left it. "That was more people than I expected," Caleb said. "I told you." "You said it might be more than 10. You didn't say it'd be 23. "I didn't control the guest list. It evolved. Organically, chaotically." But she didn't sound displeased. The yard was quiet again by 9 o'clock. Inside, the house was warm. They'd kept a fire going all day, and it smelled like the food people had brought, and the particular smell of a place that's been full of noise and is now settling back into itself. Nora sat down at the desk. Not to work. The ledger was closed. The correspondence was done. There was nothing that needed accounting tonight. She just sat there because it was where she thought best, and she had something she wanted to think through. She'd received a letter the week before that she hadn't mentioned to Caleb. It was from a woman in a neighboring county, name of Sorensen, who'd written to ask about the Hale case. Apparently, Forsyth's office had published a summary of the fraud methodology in the Territorial Legal Gazette, dry, technical reading, not something most people would see. But this woman's brother had shown her the entry and she'd recognized something in the description. Her family had a loan arrangement with a land broker named Pelletier. The patterns, she wrote, sounded familiar. Nora had written back asking for more information. Pelletier might be nothing. He might be a legitimate broker who'd made poor documentation choices. He might be entirely unrelated to anything Hale had done. Or he might not be. She hadn't said anything to Caleb yet because she was still deciding what to do. They'd just gotten through 14 months of legal battles. They'd just gotten married. The ranch was finally running the way it should. The sensible thing was to let it rest, to let Forsyth's office handle any new complaints, to trust the system that it actually, against considerable odds, worked. The less sensible thing was to write back to Mrs. Sorensen tomorrow and ask for copies of the contracts. She sat with the choice for a while. The fire crackled. The horses were quiet in the barn. She knew what she was going to do. She'd known it since she opened Mrs. Sorensen's letter. She was going to write back because the woman had recognized something and reached out, and that took courage. And courage deserved a response. She was going to ask for the contracts because if there was something wrong in those numbers, she would see it. And if she saw it, she couldn't pretend she hadn't. That was just who she was. She'd made a kind of peace with it somewhere in the past year. The fact that she was not, and would probably never be, the kind of person who could know something was wrong and look the other way. It cost her sleep and ease in that simple version of a quiet life she'd imagined when she answered the advertisement. But it was also why she was here, in this house, with this ranch, with this life. You couldn't separate the difficult parts from the rest. They were the same thing. Caleb appeared in the doorway. "Coming to bed?" "In a while." He looked at the desk, at the letter half hidden under the ledger. She hadn't hidden it intentionally, but she hadn't moved it either. He had the eyes of a man who noticed things without always mentioning it. "Something you're working on?" She considered. "A letter. From a woman in the next county. She thinks her family might have a situation similar to ours." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "Write back. Ask for the contracts." She looked at him. "Is that all right?" He came into the room and sat down in the chair across from her, the way he had on the first night she'd laid out the ledgers. "You're asking me? We're partners. The ranch is both of ours. If I take on something like this again, it affects you too." He thought about it, genuinely thought, not just reflexively agreed. How bad could it be? "I don't know yet. Could be nothing, could be another Hale. And if it's another Hale, then someone needs to catch it." She met his eyes. "I'd rather it be us than nobody." Caleb leaned back. He was wearing the expression she'd come to think of as him doing his real thinking, not the closed-off quiet of early, but a genuine working through. "Can we do it without it consuming everything again? Without the 14 months of probably not, if it's serious? Probably yes, if we're smarter about it from the start. Build the evidence before filing instead of building it simultaneously." She paused. "And Forsyth's office knows what to look for now. We're not starting from scratch." "You've already been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it since I opened the letter." He was quiet. Then, "Write back, see what the contracts say." He stood up. "We've gotten through worse with less." "Yes, we have." He left her to it. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began composing a letter to Mrs. Sorensen. Careful, measured, asking the right questions without leading the answers. What were the original loan terms? How long had payments been made? What did the balance statement show? She worked until the fire burned down to coals and the house got cold enough that she had to put her coat on over her nightgown, which was not ideal but was a problem she'd have indefinitely until she broke the habit of working past midnight. Outside, the valley was the particular dark of a clear mountain night. Not quite black, lit at the edges by starlight reflecting off the snow, still sitting high on the ridgelines. The creek made its constant quiet sound. An owl called once and went silent. She thought about something Henderson had said at the gathering, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. The way people say important things sideways, slipped into a sentence where they can pretend it doesn't weigh much. He'd said, "The thing about Red Hollow is that it keeps pulling people back, even the ones who left, even the ones who had every reason to stay away." She'd thought about that later, about what makes a place that kind of thing. Whether it's the land itself or the water or the particular way the mountains hold the valley, or whether it's something that has nothing to do with geography at all, whether it's the specific accumulation of choices that people made in a specific place, layered up over time until the place carries the weight of them. She thought that was probably it. That places are made of what people did in them, what they fought for, and what they refused to let go, and what they chose, again and again, when the easier choice was to leave. Red Hollow had been a dying valley when she arrived. Not dying from poverty or isolation or bad land, dying because someone had systematically leached the life out of it, family by family, until the people who remained had learned to make themselves small and quiet and invisible as a survival strategy. And then it hadn't died, because a woman who was bad at being invisible showed up with a trunk full of nothing and a head full of numbers and too much stubborn pride to let the math lie to her face. She hadn't saved it alone. That was the point she'd keep making, to herself and to anyone who told the story differently. She hadn't saved it alone, and she'd known that all along, even when it felt like she was the only one awake at 2 a.m. What she'd done was go first, walk through the door first so other people could follow. That was what courage actually was, she'd come to think. Not the absence of fear, not some extraordinary quality that certain people had and others lacked. Just the willingness to take the first step when you're scared, so the person behind you has a path to follow. She finished the letter to Mrs. Sorensen and set it on the stack going out with the morning mail. Then she banked the fire and went upstairs, stepping over the 3rd stair that creaked. She'd learned every sound the house made, every quirk and fault and particular, and into the room where Caleb was asleep, one arm thrown over the empty side of the bed, in the unconscious way that meant he'd been waiting for her even while sleeping. She stood there a moment. The moonlight came through the thin curtains and fell across the floor in a pale bar. The mountains were a dark shape through the window, closer seeming at night. She thought, I have stayed in places because I had no choice. This is the first place I stayed because I chose to. That seemed worth noting. She got into bed. Caleb stirred without waking. The house settled around them, the old familiar creaks and sighs of wood that has seen decades of cold. Through the walls came the distant sound of the creek, still moving under the ice, finding its way in the dark. She didn't sleep immediately. She lay looking at the ceiling and running through the questions she'd ask Mrs. Sorensen, the way she'd organize the contracts if they came in the right order, the logical structure of an investigation that might be nothing or might be something and wouldn't reveal itself until she actually sat down with the numbers. She was already looking forward to it. That was the true thing, uncomfortable as it was to admit. Not the fight itself, she wasn't that kind of person, didn't enjoy conflict for its own sake, but the clarity of it. The way that numbers, when applied honestly to dishonest situations, became a kind of justice that didn't depend on anyone's opinion of you, or how powerful you were, or whether people believed you. Numbers just were, and she was good at them, and that turned out to be enough to matter. The wedding ring on her finger was a simple band. She'd told Caleb nothing elaborate, and he'd taken her at her word, which she appreciated more than she'd expected. It was warm against her skin in the cold room. She thought about the advertisement she'd answered over a year ago. Seeking wife, ranch struggling. No promises of comfort. Need someone who won't break. She'd written back the same night because there was something honest in those words that everything else she'd seen in the Gazette wasn't. She hadn't broken. That much was true, though she'd bent considerably in ways she hadn't predicted. You couldn't live through a year like the one she'd had without some things changing shape, some things she'd believed that turned out to be wrong. Some fears she'd thought were permanent that turned out to be temporary. Some certainties she'd been carrying since childhood that she'd quietly set down along the way you drop things you've been carrying so long you forgot they were weight. She'd believed she was fundamentally alone. She'd believed that depending on people was a structural weakness. She'd believed that places and things and other people were impermanent by nature, and that the only reliable currency was her own ability to survive without them. She'd been wrong about all three. Or not entirely wrong. Life was complicated enough that most things weren't entirely wrong, but wrong enough that the corrections had mattered. She was still not easy to live with. She still worked too much and forgot to eat, and had arguments with herself in the margins of ledgers, and cared more about other people's problems than was probably sustainable. She still woke sometimes in the early hours with the particular anxiety of someone who spent too many years waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the ranch was there in the morning, and Caleb was there. And down the road, Henderson's lights were on at first light because he was an early riser, and the new place had north-facing windows that caught the dawn. And across the valley, the mountains were always there, indifferent and enormous and oddly comforting in the way that things much larger than yourself can be comforting, because they suggest that whatever is happening to you is happening in a world that has context. She fell asleep eventually, the way she always did, not gradually, but decisively, like a number resolving to its final answer. Outside, Red Hollow slept. The creek moved. The horses were warm in the barn. The stone at the north fence line sat where Caleb had placed it, cold and permanent, keeping its small witness over land that had been fought for and lost and nearly stolen and recovered, and finally, stubbornly, kept. Somewhere in the territorial prison, Victor Hale had 15 years to think about the fact that his downfall had begun with a woman reading a ledger on her first night in a strange house. The mathematics of it were simple, and he had a long time to add them up. In the morning, Nora would get up before dawn and write her follow-up questions to Mrs. Sorensen. She would make coffee, better than she used to make it, though still not perfect, and sit at the desk in the thin early light and look at what needed doing next. There would always be something that needed doing next. She'd stopped finding that oppressive somewhere along the way and started finding it, instead, like a reason. A reason to stay. A reason to work. A reason to be here. In this house. In this valley. In this particular life she'd built from a train ticket and a worn trunk and the stubborn conviction that wrong numbers deserved to be corrected. The mountains held the valley. The valley held the ranch. The ranch held everything that mattered. And that was enough. Not perfect. Nothing was perfect. And she'd learned to distrust perfection anyway, because in her experience, things that looked too clean usually had something hidden underneath them. But real, solid, worth the work it took to keep. She'd come to Red Hollow looking for somewhere to survive. She'd found somewhere to live. There was a difference, and it turned out that difference was everything.
So? Oh shit, you're dead, sorry. Never mind! Wait, no, you're dead. Wait, no, you're alive. No, wait. Are you dead? I don't know what you are. Okay, you lived. Nice. This game is so stupid. I actually think it is. This is so balanced. This champ is terrible. Been there doing your voice lines.
My god, you guys know me so well. I didn't think anyone noticed me.
I can tell by the tone of his voice that he just considered a murder-suicide.
What? What are we saying? I ain't no murderer.
It just flashed through his head. And I don't blame him.
I would never hurt a fly. Actually, I would have hurt a fly. I do not like insects. I'm fine with insects as long as they're not fucking with me. Then I'm not fine with them.
Sam is the best and is better Kaisa than me, Ben. I don't think anybody said that.
I have said that.
I would love to hear the tone that with which you said it.
I was so serious.
I'm sure.
I meant every word.
I'm sure.